Today on Radio Free History, How Art Got Ugly continues. We have been looking at the abstract modernist aesthetics of the 1920s. Today we move to the more realistic and conservative looks of the 1930s. But while the 20s dominate the standard art history narrative, the 30s are often forgotten, if not outright ignored. This series has gone on long enough that in our first episode, at the end of 2024, we started by looking at the finalists of the 2024 Turner Prize, and they were all equally horrible.
It's like the art Special Olympics.
So in the interest of consistency, because it's now January 2026, I decided to look up who was the winner of the 2025 Turner Prize. Now, unlike the 2024 finalists, where they were all terrible, but they were all terrible in an entertaining way.
Yeah, like The Room.
Yeah, the three finalists who didn't win, they're just sad. You can look them up on their own. They're not even worth talking about. They're not even funny to talk about. They're just depressing. One's like a non-binary girl with her head shaved and a bunch of shitty tattoos. Like, there's nothing original there.
I wonder which horrible, expensive private school she went to.
Well, I said that the losers weren't worth talking about, but the winner is at least enough of an interesting train wreck that we can do our Beavis and Butthead spiel about her.
Oh, I can't wait.
This is Nena Kalu.
Oh, my God.
That even looks like a participation trophy that she's wearing.
Looks like a mugshot. Just freaking what, you scribbled on the thing in the book. It looks like an ear.
So this is from the BBC. I'm reading this verbatim. Nena Kalu has won this year's Turner Prize, the UK's most high-profile art award, for her bold and compelling sculptures and drawings, and has made history as the first artist with a learning disability to win.
Is it oppositional defiant disorder?
No. Oh. Yeah, she is an autistic, learning disabled artist with limited verbal communication.
Oh, wow.
So they're trying to, force another Daniel Dale on us.
Well, this really is the art Special Olympics.
Yes. The problem is this was already done 20 years ago with Wesley Willis.
Yeah, he did it better.
Yes.
He headbutted people. Cut the mullet, indeed.
Yeah. This is like depressing retarded. Wesley Willis was funny retarded.
Yes. See him. If I see this lady on the bus, I'm gonna feel bad about society. If I see Wesley Willis on the bus, hey, that made my day.
Especially because he's dead.
Yeah, that's bad.
Also, I said retarded. There goes us in the algorithm. You're not supposed to say that till 10 minutes in if you don't want to get buried. But you know what? This is Radio Free History. We're just going for it.
We are thankfully not dependent on a YouTube paycheck. That's what we can say what we want. Wesley Willis was performing in Chicago. One of my friends was in the attendance, and he set up his equipment and then leaned into the mic and said, "My dick's gotta piss," and walked off stage.
See, that's a savant. This woman is not a savant. Charlotte Hollenshed, who has worked with her for 25 years, said on stage at the ceremony, "This is a major, major moment for a lot of people. It's seismic. It's broken a very stubborn glass ceiling." It has not broken a glass ceiling. We've been trying to promote retards in the art world for decades.
Is this like a situation where it's like that lady that slept with the retarded guy? The Jewish one? Does she have a helper that's kind of masquerading this?
What's her name?
Helen Keller also had a similar situation where the guy was writing fanfic through.
What's her name? Anne Stubenfeld or something like that?
Anne Stubblefield.
Yeah, whatever it was.
It was if I were to tell you the story of Anne Stubblefield, it would be oh, why are you reading an anti-Semitic cartoon from the 30s? It's the most horrible story. You're breaking zero stereotypes. And I wonder if there's another, somebody kind of play acting with this, using this specimen as maybe, maybe some
for those of you who don't know, she was a professor of the Hebraic persuasion who decided to know in the biblical sense one of her patients with a quite low IQ.
Yeah, nonverbal. But she thought that she could make him talk with this magical technique.
And she framed it so that she's the victim here.
Yeah. Yeah, she went on, she got out of jail after she went to court and argued that, like, look, if he's that disabled, I really didn't hurt him. And the judge was like, okay, so she got out of jail. And then, she did a documentary. Now, if I had done this, I would never show my face in society ever again. I would go the Carla Homolka route, where I'm like hiding from the public and just documentary about why she did it. And anyway.
Speaking of academics manipulating retards, the judges praised Kalu's brightly colored sculptures, which are haphazardly wrapped in layers of ribbon, string, card, and shiny VHS tape. And her drawings of swirling tornado-like shapes.
Okay, yeah.
Let's look at these colored sculptures made from ribbon and string and VHS tape.
Is that her picture on her fucking ribbon?
Yes!
Oh my god!
It's actually VHS tape.
This looks like a horror movie, like for Muppets.
Yes,
that's what I'm taking it.
It's like
the Feebles.
Yeah, well, it
kind of dark Muppet.
It looks like a '90s horror movie where like the villain is making people play his twisted game, and this looks like the hideout you go into before he's jumped somebody with a knife.
Some freaking some Mr. Gein inspired thing, wearing the body parts.
So these are her colored sculptures haphazardly wrapped in layers of ribbon and shit. Let's look at her drawings of swirling tornado-like shapes.
All right. Now there's a homeless lady living in a park by my house, and she does something similar with the marker on my building a couple of times a year. So why isn't she in the, getting all these accolades? Why are we freaking...
My grandfather was born in the 30s, and those of you kids may not be familiar with a toy called a spirograph. Everybody could do these things in my grandfather's generation by buying a spirograph and sticking a pen in it.
Yeah, they built a simple machine that could do this. And now, I guess the lady is the spirograph. That's to the helper, probably. This looks like when they say, like, hey, we taught an elephant to paint. I think this is kind of what you get.
We taught an elephant to paint, and now it won the Turner Prize.
Oh, that'll be next.
She did win the Turner Prize.
Yeah, you wait till the vegans take over. They're going to have, like, Margaret the elephant painted this expressive thing.
That's For those of you who tuned in for the more cerebral portion of our episode, I'm not going to say we apologize. We don't apologize, but anyways, we're moving on to that.
Never trust smart people with no sense of humor.
No. Today we're going to start by getting a little bit philosophical. Again, some of you members of our audience are too young to remember things. If you're too young to remember the world before 9/11, no, we're not talking about this art on the screen. Don't worry. It is thematic, but
actually, I can see that. They call it Ground Zero.
Yeah, if you're too young to remember the world pre 9/11, it's almost impossible for me to convey the mood of the late 90s to you. Like the Bush years were dystopian, especially if you were against the global war on terror.
And we were.
And we were, yes. Completely was.
Not because we were hippies, because we were like, this is going to bankrupt the States.
And it did. Yep. Then you had the Obama years, which were like 8 years of malaise following the financial crisis. And then since Trump came down that escalator in 2015, which, holy shit, was 11 years ago, people have been in all sorts of strong moods, but none of those moods could be described as relaxed optimism.
No, this is full-on moral panic.
But, the mood of the 90s was relaxed optimism.
Yeah, everything was going to be okay. When I was a kid, I went on my first plane ride down to Florida. Mm-hmm. And I was nervous, so they brought me into the cockpit, had me talk to the pilots, and was like, don't worry, kid, I'm really good at this. It was a corn-fed boy from Alabama who'd done like 15 years in the Air Force.
And you didn't get your testicles scrubbed by some TSA agent.
Nope, you walked on in. We're still doing that. That's a tribute to the troops. Every time I'm freaking getting frisked, because I'm a bigger guy, so they gotta either put me in the naked machine or frisk me. So like,
yeah. Anyways, Some cracks had started to appear in the facade by the turn of the millennium, like the Florida election in 2000 and the Enron scandal.
Fuck you, Elia Gonzalez. Changing world history by washing up on a beach.
Well, for the most part, right up until September 10th, 2001, there was every indication that the system worked, if imperfectly, and it was just going to continue working. In 1999, 5 movies came out: Fight Club, Office Space, Eyes Wide Shut, The Matrix, and American Beauty. These movies were all very different, but they had one thing in common. The protagonist was middle class, dependent on the system to make a living, and he desperately wanted to break the mold somehow. In the case of Eyes Wide Shut, he wanted to enter the world of the elites and saw some horrifying things when he peeked back behind the curtain. In Fight Club, he wanted to escape the system by any means necessary, including less than legal means. But in all 5 movies, the system was portrayed as so all-encompassing and so stable that the story might as well have been a man versus nature story.
Yeah. Guy versus his environment. Everything's just been so integrated into the production chain.
Yep. After 9/11, and certainly after the 2008 financial crisis, and unquestionably after Trump's election, nobody sees the system as stable anymore.
Nope. I'm sitting here in Toronto waiting for freaking Yankee troops to parachute in. Like, that's where we're at.
Yeah, maybe the system is still too big for one person to fix, and maybe the system has too much inertia for one person to change anything, for better or for worse. But the system is rotting from the inside, and it's starting to collapse under its own weight, and everybody can see it. Nobody thinks the system is a well-oiled machine that's going to look the same in 100 years. That idea may have been in the zeitgeist in 1999. It is not in the zeitgeist now.
Talk to any Zoomer, man. These kids have no hope.
Yeah.
These kids are like, oh, I might live long enough to starve to death.
Well, I mean, the only real question is whether it's going to be a long, gradual decline or whether it's going to be a sudden collapse, like the Soviet Union.
Oh, yeah, keep in mind that, like, you know, it's like an elderly relative getting sick. Like, they can be on the bed for a few days. They can be on the bed for many years. Yeah. So it's just...
Yep.
Like, this might be like a 3-century freaking decline, like Rome, right?
Well, how long was the Ottoman Empire called the sick man of Europe?
Yeah, good point.
Now, I'm a millennial, and for a long time I held out hope that the system was going to iron out its kinks and we would somehow get back to the vibes of the 90s. It's 2026 now. Somebody who was 5 on 9/11 is now in his or her 30s. When 30-year-olds have no concept of a world where you trusted things to be okay, that world is not coming back. There's not even an appetite to bring it back.
No, these kids are looking to... The other thing is when the system has seen better days, a lot of radical groups and strongmen start looking at it and saying, I can take them.
That's apropos because we're talking about the 30s today.
Hey, look at that.
Yeah, in 1999, the zeitgeist allowed for 5 movies, probably more than 5, about people who were bored out of their minds or otherwise discontent with their role as a cog in the system because they just felt the system was too fucking stable.
Yep. Too stable, too wealthy, too easy to survive.
That system was portrayed as soul-draining. Sometimes it was even portrayed as outright evil, but it was just a given that that system would go on forever, unchanging in Fukuyama's end of history. Now try explaining to a Zoomer the appeal of a movie like Office Space, where the joke is that your life and your job are so stable that you want to jump out of your skin, and you're jealous of your neighbor who works in construction because he gets physical activity.
These kids did not grow up in the Shire, folks.
But the thing is, that was the zeitgeist in 1999, just 2 years before 9/11 changed everything and made movies like that completely impossible. I thought that we'd go back to that. We never did, and we're never going to.
And it made every movie that shows the skyline of New York into a very awkward experience for those of us that remember the before times.
Well, I say this because there's an exact analogy to the year 1937. 2 years later, World War II broke out, killing tens of millions of people and changing every aspect of culture from top to bottom. But here's a picture of the 1937 World's Fair in Paris.
Ooh.
What do you notice about this?
My eye, someone with Slavic blood, my eye is immediately drawn to the guy holding the hammer and sickle.
Yep.
Well, on the other side, that looks like maybe, I don't know, Mussolini or something.
No, that's the Nazi pavilion on the left.
Oh, that would have been my other guess.
Yeah, so the thing about the Paris 1937 Expo is that contemporary critics talked about how all the pavilions were largely small and tasteful, with two exceptions. The Nazis and the Soviets.
Go big or go home.
Yep. In many ways, this picture is part of a storyline centuries in the making, which ended abruptly in 1939. Certainly for the Germans, after 1945, they were going to be occupied by American and Soviet troops and not allowed to have any of their organic culture anymore.
No, none of that. Prussia? No more Prussia. No.
It's amazing that people just met in a room, signed a piece of paper saying Prussia doesn't exist anymore.
Well, every woman in Berlin was being essayed by communists.
Yep. This world that you see in this photograph, it's part of the continuous storyline that we've been looking at for the last 11 episodes. Everything, we've been talking about culminates in this picture, and yet 2 years after this picture, this whole thing is just dead, reduced to rubble.
Yeah, there's a painter standing in front of that tower, taking a very iconic picture.
Well, like I said, after 1945, organic German culture was unacceptable to the Soviet Union, the United States, and certain, let's just call them international interests. But I bring this up because there is no way for anybody, not you, not me, not anybody, to understand the zeitgeist in this picture. Mm-hmm. There is no way to understand the zeitgeist of 1937 in the same way that there is no way for a Zoomer to understand the zeitgeist of 1999. We'll never understand the culture of 1937, the culture of this picture, but we can still get a glimmer of 1937 in the same way that Zoomers can get a glimmer of 1999.
If they had the attention span to watch an old movie.
Okay, fair. In theory, they could. But it would also be a mistake to write off the 90s as the before times, because we can't forget that the culture of the 90s still casts a huge shadow on us. Let's, for example...
Especially me.
Well...
I like ska punk.
Well, I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about, on a more substantial level. Let's look at the current state of, South Africa.
Oh, no, that's, yeah. I was in a good mood. I bring up South Africa.
That used to be a country with a space program.
Wow.
That was the country that performed the world's first heart transplant. The guy survived about 2.5 weeks and died. It was still impressive.
They had, I guess we can say, spare people.
Well, now South Africa is a country with collapsing infrastructure and a failing electrical grid and the world's largest income disparity.
Liberia.
Well,
too. Electric boogaloo.
Well, what changed in South Africa?
I don't think we can say that on YouTube.
Well, I'm just saying, what changed happened in the 90s. That's the point I'm trying to make.
I guess we'll never know.
Yeah, we will know. In the early 90s, political correctness was in vogue to the point where the boomers just needed their own Martin Luther King. And they decided to force South Africa to get rid of their perfectly functional system so that suburban American women could turn on the 6 o'clock news, hear a story about a black guy heading up multiracial democracy. They actually called it the fucking Rainbow Nation.
Yes, they did. I remember that.
These suburban women would pat themselves on the back, wipe a tear from their eyes, and say, "This is just a total inspiration." It's hilarious when you look at murder rates during and after apartheid.
Yeah.
Because when you try to look up the numbers, every source says, well, we can't trust numbers before 1994 since accurate records weren't kept during apartheid.
Oh, fuck.
As if a country with the space program is going to keep the less accurate records.
It's pretty hard to ignore a body. That's the one thing states tend to do pretty well, is keep track of the number of murder victims.
Well, the important thing is that the made-for-TV image of Nelson Mandela and the Rainbow Nation It made boomers feel good about themselves in the 90s.
Old man river.
Yep. Well, to this day, we can't fix anything because the post-apartheid Constitution of South Africa is like a sacred cow of the ruling class of the United States.
It's part of their dogma.
You know, you can say that 90s culture is dead, because it is, but a lot of the problems in the world are rooted directly in that post-Cold War optimism that feel-good liberalism is finally going to work now that the Soviet Union's gone.
Yeah, they already destroyed Rhodesia.
Well, and that's the other thing. Like, Americans have never been the least bit shy about using faraway countries as a proving ground for their retarded ideas.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, the communism in Asia.
So just as it's dangerous to completely write off the culture of the 90s in understanding the current world, it is just as dangerous to reduce the 1930s to the Great Depression and say that everything was changed by World War II. Yes, the culture of 1937 is just as dead as the culture of 1999. In fact, in some ways, Europe in 1937 was still the Europe that gave us Shakespeare and Mozart. Europe since 1945 is something different. There is no Shakespeare and no Mozart coming out of Europe today.
No.
That fact is incredibly relevant to a series called How Art Got Ugly, the fact that there's never going to be another Mozart.
Yeah, sorry, yes, Austria.
But it's a huge mistake to start that story in 1945 because there were absolutely seeds planted in the 30s that grew in the late 40s and in the 50s. Unfortunately, there's a challenge. Everything written by a respectable source starts in 1945.
The hinge of history.
Yeah. Well, 1945 was the start of the current international order. The United Nations and the so-called rule-based order are the result of World War II. Every political order is kept stable through propaganda, and the current political order is no exception.
No getting around it, folks.
Yeah, we like to think that propaganda is just for authoritarian dictatorships. That's just wishful thinking.
And we forget how much that even in a quote-unquote free country, how much their propaganda can affect us.
Well, forget their propaganda. Think about our propaganda.
Yeah.
If propaganda didn't work in the West, why is it that all at once in 2014, every neurotic teenage girl decided to stop identifying as bisexual and start identifying as trans?
It was weird. It's like they all got an email.
Just all at once.
It was quick. They all it was like somebody yelled, "Attack!"
Well, more importantly, though, why is the number one predictor of transgenderism whether a kid speaks English?
Yeah, and just that suggests a social contagion rather than a new state of being somehow evolving in the 2015s.
Well, a man who we're going to be talking about more in the next episode than this one, Joseph Goebbels.
Oh,
He said that propaganda works best when you're telling the truth.
Yep.
But presenting the truth in a way that you want the masses to understand it. As anybody who's ever worked in advertising can tell you, you can convince the masses to believe a lot of crazy things, but outright lies only work for so long. They do work for a little while. People can be quite gullible, but you can only play that game so many times before the public gets angry at you.
Yep.
So, starting every story in 1945 is just the magician's misdirection. Every post-World War II narrative starts with the Nuremberg trials and the Berlin airlift, the atomic bomb dropping, and the signing of the UN Charter. When all of your stories start in 1945, it's a lot easier to accept the current state of affairs. In the official narrative, the Americans are the good guys, but if you fuck with them, they won't hesitate to drop a nuke on Hiroshima.
Yep.
And World War II is no longer a historical event. It's an origin myth, told with such moral gravitas that Nazi and Hitler are now used as shorthand for unquestionable evil.
Yeah.
Well, this is not a new technique either, though. I mean, before World War II, the narrative started with Henry VIII because the Protestant political order began when he kicked out the Catholic Church and closed down the monasteries.
Fat bastard.
Well, it's a lot easier to view Henry VIII as the father of Anglicanism than as a mediocre king who tried to invade France and got his ass kicked.
Yep.
But you know what? If his first wife had given him a son, that's how he would be remembered.
A bitch.
Well, in the current day, every modern government is run by a bureaucracy staffed by a university system that was expanded in the mid-20th century. And the more that a narrative justifies the current political order, the more socially and professionally acceptable it will be to repeat that narrative. And that's why post-1945 academics have a few no-go zones. They don't talk about the American Civil War, World War II, or the Civil Rights Movement in any way other than talking about these things as a righteous moral crusade.
Yeah, and they will destroy you if you frickin' deviate from that narrative even a little.
What do the American Civil War, World War II, and the Civil Rights Movement all have in common?
No,
No, not World War II. World War II is a slightly different special interest group.
They didn't fight over there. They unleashed them.
Well, all three of those things establish the current political order, at least within the United States, which is the global hegemon.
Yeah, it's been exporting culture since, or was the freaking cultural global hegemon until social media and the fact that Hollywood now has to kowtow to Beijing because they're worried about the Chinese box office.
Well, it's verboten to do a narrative that walks through the events of either the Civil War, World War II, or the Civil Rights Movement and concludes that things got worse.
Yep.
You can talk about it as if things got better. You cannot do a before, during, and after analysis and say, yeah, things got worse. That's just absolutely verboten. But that's what we're doing.
Yay!
One other thing you might add to that list is African decolonization, which was a pet. Yeah, that was a pet project of the American intellectual establishment, and it left Africa in, let's just say, worse shape than it was under European colonialism.
Yeah.
You have to talk about colonialism like it was the worst thing ever if you want to keep your job as an academic, because otherwise the U.S. government looks bad. Yeah. It's as simple as that.
When I started traveling in Asia, I was shocked to hear everybody talk positively about the colonists and what they brought. And the Malaysian National Museum is divided into 5 regions, all of which represent a wave of colonization.
The Portuguese took us over and they gave us weapons. Then the Dutch took us over. They showed us how to build a port. Then the British took us over. They showed us how to run a government. And the Japanese took us over, and we don't talk about that. Yeah, the boomers, they were the first generation to grow up with this post-1945 propaganda narrative, and it was fed to them through the 1-2 punch of television and the expanded university system, so they never had a shot. Every book from a major publisher and every Hollywood movie either ends before 1939 or it starts after 1945, unless there's a childhood flashback filmed through a sepia filter to make it very clear that this is the old days. This is the before times. Back to the Future. Look at that movie. It featured the very odd narrative mechanism of being able to travel anywhere in time with a flying car, but going back to 1950s suburbia, the boomer's childhood.
Yeah. Go anywhere else? No. I'm going to go back to where...
Forrest Gump, that movie started with a flashback to his childhood where he got to meet Elvis Presley, and that movie might as well have been subtitled Forrest Gump, the story of a boomer who got to meet everyone the boomer saw on TV.
Shows you the power of that technology.
Yeah.
And again, this is before, to say a word in the boomers' defense, before television, you had to trust an announcer describing something to you. You had to read it. You had to trust somebody writing something. All of a sudden, you could see what was going on. The amount of credulity, especially with these kids that were put in front of these devices,
Well, the problem is right now, yes, the Zoomers aren't watching TV anymore. Unfortunately, they can't read.
Oh, yeah.
As you said, in the boomers' defense, it's a lot easier to accept the status quo of the post-war political order if you just don't question the framing of the war as good versus evil. And it's a lot easier to accept that framing if you're inundated with feel-good propaganda where the frame is just kind of there and everything works.
Fuck you, Dresden.
Of course, things are not just there, and you can see this by rewinding the clock a few years to 1937. In 1937, when this picture is taken, Paris is still the center of the art world. The British Empire still ruled a quarter of the world's dry land. The United States was in the middle of the New Deal, where college graduates who lost their jobs in the Great Depression are now working for the bureaucracy, bringing plumbing and the electrical grid to some remote town in Alabama.
Remember when bureaucracies used to accomplish things?
Yeah. Oh, that's the 30s. That's a long time ago. Italy's under fascist rule. Spain is having a civil war that never seems to fit nicely into any narrative.
No.
And 3 countries have a totalizing ideology that they're willing to fight to impose on others. Germany has National Socialism, the Soviet Union has Marxist-Leninism, and the United States has liberal democracy. In 1945, liberal democracy wins by force. Just ask the citizens of Rhodesia or South Africa.
You people are consumers now.
Yeah, just ask them what happens when you run your multiracial country in a way that is so functional that it makes the Americans look bad, especially after the Civil Rights Movement. But in 1937, all the chips are still on the table. Nobody knew what ideology is going to win, if an ideology is going to win, or if the British Empire is just going to continue as a going concern. All the chips are in play.
Everything is in flux.
But the biggest difference, if you go back and read any primary document from the 1930s, is that in 1937, the United States is just another country. Nobody views the Americans as the world's policemen or the moral arbiters of everything. Nowadays, you see the attitude that if Pedro moves from Tijuana to the barrio in El Paso, gets a green card, and takes a citizenship oath in a few years, he is just as American as the guy whose ancestors came over on the Mayflower. Nobody thought this way in 1937. In 1937, American was the name of an ethnic group that traced its ancestral roots to the British Isles, with maybe a bit of Dutch admixture. Within 8 years, Europe was reduced to rubble. Only the Americans and the Soviets were left standing. And they were both determined to spread their utopian ideologies to Europe during the post-war order. And any Western European elites who wanted to have any say in the matter needed to get on board with American liberal democracy so that they could be part of the American State Department's pet project, the United Nations. And if you want to see what happened to people who didn't want to get on board with the Americans' pet project, if you have a stronger stomach, look into the denazification process.
They took them, literally marched like regular citizens into concentration camps and were like, you did this!
They executed newspaper editors. They talk about the Nazis as being so evil because they burned books. The fucking Americans would find any book that mentioned the Nazis and mulch it. Yeah, in 1937, the Americans were the optimistic Protestants who gave the world Walt Whitman and Edgar Allan Poe. But in 1945, the Americans were now the bitchy gay hall monitor who would spread gossip about you and ruin your life if they thought you were too proud of your ancestors. And for a good 50 years, they had the military and economic power to back it up.
Yep.
But every bitchy gay guy seems to have the exact same downfall, which is that he decides to have unprotected sex with the wrong ethnic minority.
I was going to say meth, but we're talking about the same thing.
Well, in the 90s, the Americans did just that when they decided to pursue free trade with China. And just like a gay guy having bareback sex, it seems great when you match with them on Grindr, but a few years later, your immune system has been destroyed and you're dependent on prescription drugs. How's that for an analogy?
It's a graphic, I guess. Maybe not algorithm friendly, but that's it.
We've said retard like 10 times already, and we're only on like the 4th slide.
Exactly.
I kid our American viewers, but we have watched the rise of American hegemony, and we're now past the peak. The world is descending into multipolarity. And we can now take an objective look at things. During the rise to dominance, it's hard to question things, but when you enter a decline, that is the time that the propaganda trance starts to break. So now is the time to break the frame and ask what really happened. And that means we are not going to start in 1945. You will rarely see a book written by a credentialed academic that starts in 1930 and slowly walks through the war all the way to about 1960. That is exactly what we're going to do with the remainder of this series. So the end is in sight after a year of this stuff. We are going to break the propaganda, and we are going to see how art played a role in that propaganda. Now, we left off at the end of the 1920s with the founding of the Museum of Modern Art in 1929. The 1930s are an enigma because the official historical narrative just doesn't talk about the 1930s. You have the Great Depression. It led to the New Deal in America. You have Chamberlain trying to appease Hitler and Churchill saying no. Then you have Hitler invading Poland, and that's about the entire story you get taught in school. Mm. And there are events that are absolutely verboten about the 1930s to put in a school curriculum, like the Holodomor.
Yeah, Hitler's gay bodyguard.
Well, the reason that you can't talk about the Holodomor is that the West supported Stalin enthusiastically as he starved 7 million peasants. And not during wartime, during peacetime.
Yep. Specifically Ukrainian peasants.
Well, the World War II origin myth depends on Hitler being the most evil man who ever lived because he committed a wartime genocide. That is a much harder sell when the good guys committed a genocide at peacetime of the same magnitude. And the more you look into the 1930s, the more you realize just how popular communism and Stalin and the Soviet project were, at least in American high society and in the American halls of power in the 1930s. And that gets completely airbrushed out.
Yeah, academia is weirdly left-wing in a lot of subjects. And it's the kind of subjects, like if you take them at like Mick University, you go nowhere. But if you take them at like Princeton, you become like, a member of the fucking deep state or whatever.
Yep. Oh, just wait till we get to the post-World War II stuff. In fact, like I said, this is the rest of this series is supposed to be one continuous story arc from about 1930 to 1960. Yeah, keep that in mind. Like I said, a lot of what we call art was just government propaganda. We like to think that was just the Nazis and the Soviets. No.
Yeah.
Probably the biggest lie told in the 20th century is that the United States of America has ever been opposed to communism. The 30s were called the Pink Decade or the Red Decade when New York City was called the most interesting part of the Soviet Union. Just take a look at how, during the Cold War, they never really batted an eyelash as communist China took over Tibet.
Yeah.
Or consider how Cuba was an enemy, but it was never such a big enemy that they had to remove Fidel Castro by any means necessary, unlike they felt compelled to do so with Rhodesia and apartheid South Africa.
Yeah, good point.
To steal a point from Curtis Yarvin, it feels weird to say that the United States is communist, but it doesn't exactly feel weird to say that Black Americans live under communism.
No, yeah, that's about right. Yeah. It's a matriarchal experiment in a lot of cases.
So the Holodomor is a really inconvenient fact, and it's easier to deal with an inconvenient fact by just saying nothing about the entire 1930s.
My grandparents survived the Holodomor,
yep,
and then survived being POWs in Nazi Germany.
And which one did they like more?
Yeah. That's inconvenient. Anyway, so they survived the two major famines of Europe in the 20th century, so don't give me any shit for being fat.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Americans won't even bring up the Holodomor during the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine.
Yep.
The West is engaged in all sorts of anti-Russia, anti-Putin propaganda, and they won't even bring up the Holodomor, which should be a slam dunk because it was Russians killing Ukrainians by the millions.
Yep.
It is that inconvenient to bring up.
Nope, we're just going to pretend. But Stalin needed to export grain and agricultural products to get money to industrialize. So they said, wait a minute, if you export all our grain, we're going to starve to death. And Stalin said, yeah, that sounds like a you problem. And then, like, it was to where, like, if nobody in your family had died, the secret police would come in and, like, say, why hasn't anybody died? You must be hiding food. Like, it's to that level. Like,
well, to be very clear, you can't blame the Holodomor on incompetence. Like, I get it. The Russians are not exactly the Swiss when it comes to managing an operation.
Oh, he made it. He wanted to punish the Ukrainians.
Exactly.
You know, it's ancient shit. Russians killing Ukrainians is just a situation normal for that part of the world. I'm sorry.
I can believe that the Russians are so bad at planning that nobody had any food, but even the Russians can import grain when they have a bad winter.
Yeah, exactly.
An idealist can justify a lot of horrible things with his utopian fantasies. It's really hard to justify a conscious decision not to import food from Argentina or Canada.
We've been feeding these people? Stop. I don't care. Stop.
But even if we just restrict ourselves to art history, the story of the 30s is not any clearer. The official narrative comes out of the mid-20th century, and it's maintained by the Museum of Modern Art. And the narrative talks about all these weird aesthetics from the 1910s and 20s. This is Cubism. We've gone over this for the last few episodes.
If you start Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd right now. But yeah, I want to point out that this painting looks like a salvia trip.
Yeah.
So
yeah, this is called The Cathedral by Lionel Feininger. But we did a whole episode on this stuff. There's every painter in Paris was trying his hand at Cubism at this point. This guy is just one of many. What else did we have? We had Futurism.
Still also salvia trip.
Yep.
These homies were on, I guess, absent.
Well, Futurism is supposed to be like motion paintings, like a bunch of different moments in time superimposed. Do you know what this is supposed to be?
What?
It's called The Planet Mercury Passing in Front of the Sun by Bala.
Oh, fuck this. Homie couldn't frickin' find Mercury in the frickin' night sky.
This is German Expressionism. This guy got called degenerate and killed himself.
Is that lesbians?
I'm not even sure.
I think lesbian. Arguably lesbian representation with the butch one.
Yeah, I mean, we'll be talking about the Degenerate Art exhibition in the next episode, so we'll be talking about this guy.
I can't.
And of course, we can't forget suprematism.
Oh,
we spent an episode talking about this shit as well.
Whoever made this should be put in a concentration camp.
This guy was the luckiest man alive because he died right before Stalin did that stuff. This is Kazimir Malevich. And just, if you haven't been watching till this episode and you think this is, I'll use the word again, retarded, yes it is, but we told the whole story of this a few episodes back.
Why it's retarded and what happened?
So according to the narrative, after World War I, there was a desire to put the war behind us and just move forward. And across the creative endeavors, we saw new aesthetics that had certain things in common. They were all minimalist, usually not this minimalist, but somewhat minimalist. They had modern subject matter. They were self-aware, at least in the sense that they were consciously playing with the form. Like, think about Quentin Tarantino self-awarely playing with the form of filmmaking when he does Pulp Fiction.
And then think of Wesley Willis having no self-awareness at all, arguably not being conscious.
And the winner of the 2025 Turner Prize.
Exactly.
Then, according to the narrative, after the 1920s, you had this. Jackson Pollock.
Like you ran out of time, or he broke his thing, or a child did this, or this is horrible.
Well, according to the Guggenheim Museum's website, it describes this piece as, quote, exemplifying Jackson Pollock's mature abstract compositions. I think no further comment is necessary.
There was the guy who did Hedwig. He also did a porno movie called Short Bus. And the first scene of the movie, the guy comes on a freaking replica of this painting, or something similar.
They all look the same.
Yeah, I distinguish them.
Does it matter which one it is? No.
That's how I feel about this. If you can't tell, It's like if the janitor can masturbate conceivably on your painting and you can't tell that he did that or you can't prove it, that's a bad painting. I think that, I don't know. I don't ask a lot from artists, but
yeah. I'd rather somebody finish on this than on the Mona Lisa.
Seriously.
There's an issue with MoMA's narrative. MoMA was opened by the Rockefeller family in 1929, but by 1929, it was largely backward-looking. The Americans, especially the rich Americans, were trying to look cultured by keeping up with the Europeans. But for the most part, the weird 20s aesthetics had come and gone by the Paris Expo in 1925. You can watch our last episode if you want to know what I'm talking about there. But let's be generous and say that 20s modernism went all the way to 1929 for the sake of argument. Jackson Pollock had his big break in 1942 when his work was exhibited at a show called French and American Painters at the Macmillan Gallery. And then a year later in 1943, he was signed by Peggy Guggenheim. Now, 1930 to 1942 is 12 years. And 12 years is a long time in the avant-garde. But more inconveniently to the narrative, let's take a look at what prestige art looked like in the early 30s, at least in America. Look at this. This does not look like anything we just looked at.
No. This looks like the cover of Big Sleep.
Yeah? Well, to be very clear, all of this stuff would have been considered modern in 1930.
Okay.
Some of it is perhaps a bit cartoonish, like the one in the top right.
Stylized.
But, slight cartoonishness has been a mainstay of American art since Edward Hicks painted the Quakers shaking hands with the Indians next to the lion laying down with the lamb.
How'd that work out?
There's no more Indians or Quakers in that country. Yeah, so 30s American art, some of it was quite impressionist or post-impressionist, and the subject matter was usually either the industrial world or the struggles of the common man. It wasn't exactly portraiture with an aristocratic aesthetic, but I mean, by the 30s, aristocratic portraiture would have just looked bourgeois anyway. It would make you look like new money trying to fit in.
Can't afford a camera. Oh my.
More importantly, though, this art is figurative. It's not abstract. It's not like any of that abstract shit we just looked at.
Yeah, I can tell what I'm looking at here. It's not scribbles.
Yeah. Then the official narrative goes on and on about abstraction, as if that word is some artistic nirvana. But 30s art could not be any farther from abstraction.
No, I'm pretty sure I worked for the guy on the top left at some point.
It shows realistic people, if slightly stylized. Yeah, that's a good word you used. At least it's not intentionally breaking all the rules of painting just to make a point. In fact, this stuff is being quite deferential to those old rules of composition, even if the subject matter is different. The 30s aesthetic, it was quite distinctive, and it didn't look like anything that came before it. But it's fair to call this aesthetic conservative, even if some of it was outright socialist propaganda.
Yeah.
But that conservative streak is not specific to American art. We will be looking at 30s art under Hitler and Stalin as well, and we've already looked at the Novecento in Italy, and we see the same aesthetic trends there, albeit for completely different reasons. Here we see Working Maidens by Leopold Schmutzler. Here we see Woman at the Cafe in the bottom right by Antonio Donghi. And the one on the top right is The Red Army Soldier on the Collective Farm by Ucha Japardise in 1933. I don't need to tell you which country these come from.
They put my grandpa on a collective farm.
Yeah.
Because they were really good. They were a little bit too good at farming, so they were kulaks. So they got their land taken away and they got put in a collective farm. And Dito was like, so you want me to work and then just give you all the grain? And they were like, yes, and he just left.
Well, but we'll paint you smiling.
It's like a freaking great time.
So we see that something is just wrong with the art history narrative, because the 30s is figurative, but it gets lost down the memory hole. But But it's not just art history either. We see that discontinuity in a lot of places. We don't have an image of the 1930s the way that we have an image of the 50s or the 60s or even the 20s for that matter.
Yeah, I'm thinking Great Depression and I'm
Yep.
thinking Dust Bowl.
Yep,
That's it.
exactly.
And I've studied freaking history.
Yep, yeah, like when you talk about the 50s, you think about jukeboxes and poodle skirts and Elvis Presley and James Dean and all that shit.
Yeah.
Those images may be carefully constructed Hollywood propaganda, and they certainly weren't always truthful, but everybody has the same image of the 50s. Everybody has the same image of the 60s. There is no widely recognized image of the 30s. And in a previous episode, we listed all the cultural icons that come out of the 30s. This decade gave us Batman and Superman and King Kong and Dr. Seuss and the Empire State Building and Cole Porter's Anything Goes. Gave us the golden age of the pulp detective novel and Bilbo Baggins, Bugs Bunny, Gone with the Wind, and The Wizard of Oz. Clearly, there was a lot of pop culture entering the consciousness in the 30s, and yet it all seems completely disembodied in time.
When did Birth of a Nation come out?
I think that was 1915. I think that was World War
A
I.
little before that, I see.
But yeah, all this 30s art just feels like it's been around for a long time. None of it feels like it's rooted in a specific time and place. More importantly, though, this is the decade that gave the world Walt Disney. Who is more relevant to the modern pop culture than Walt Disney? Yes, he made a couple of films in the 20s, but the 30s were when Mickey Mouse became an icon, and when Disney changed American cinema with Snow White, which was the first feature-length animated film in 1937. You know, the 30s were not just a bunch of farm boys in Oliver Twist hats with dirt on their face, you know.
Oh, is that a work?
Yeah, hopping on a boxcar, hoping to find work in Nebraska before saying fuck it and moving out to Los
They
Angeles.
say there's jobs in California, eh? Get through this damn Dust Bowl.
You know, at best, yeah, that John Steinbeck shit is a low-resolution image of the 30s.
What they don't like to fucking tell you is if you kept your job, if you didn't get fired, your standard of living went up during the 30s because there's all these poor people
Well, it's just
willing to do work for you. It's like Uber now.
And if you lost a job, you could go work for the government to get an education. But yeah, at worst, the broader culture just has no image of the 30s at all, other than a bit of fear porn set in the Third Reich.
Yeah, and then they didn't, they tilled the fields in the wrong way in the Midwest.
But it's not just pop culture either. There are two major world events from the 30s which also seem to be completely disembodied from any sort of historical timeline. The Moscow trials and the Spanish Civil War.
Yep.
Those events feel as unrelated to the 1930s as Mickey Mouse does.
Yeah, that makes sense. When I think of, Orwell's Spanish Civil War diaries, it just, it
Or
doesn't.
For Whom the Bell Tolls,
I don't think about that as 30s.
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
about that as Orwell. Like it.
Yeah, so the point of the next couple of episodes, it's not just let's set the record straight on the 30s. Yes, there's an official narrative that gets taught in public schools, and yes, it intentionally avoids talking about the 30s because there's a lot of gray area in that decade, and the story needs to be black and white to justify the post-World War II order. Gray stuff doesn't work when you need your story to be black and white. But, you know, in some ways, when you correct the record, you're already conceding the frame, and I don't want to do that. I really want to get across the idea that the 1930s was just another decade. It was not the Great Depression, even though that did happen. It was not the rise of Nazi Germany, even though that did happen. And it's not just the backstory of World War II. The 1930s was just a decade. And as you said, you know, the stock market did cause some economic hardship, but it was...
Especially in Germany.
Yeah. Well... Even though it did cause hardship, the 30s was just not an age of abject poverty any more than the decade after 2008 was. And also, you know, in the age of mass immigration and diversity hiring, young men have much worse economic prospects now than they ever did in the 30s.
Especially educated young men.
So we can completely dispense with the poverty porn and start from scratch. In some ways, we have the freedom to do that. So from here on out, just the 1930s are no different than the 1970s or the 1990s. They're just a decade with an aesthetic, with a political reality, and with a zeitgeist. And fortunately for us, there is a starting point, because there actually is one example of 1930s nostalgia that was allowed into pop culture. You know what that was?
No.
Indiana Jones.
Oh, that's right.
Yep.
I missed that. No, you can't. I don't think of this as the 30s. I should.
Well, the term diesel punk was coined in the 2000s, like for fan fiction writers and cosplayers to describe the aesthetic of the 30s and the 40s. And even though the Indiana Jones trilogy was made 2 decades before the term was coined, I'd say Indiana Jones was the quintessential example of diesel punk.
Yeah, I agree with you.
I don't want to run afoul of a bunch of angry sci-fi nerds who I'm sure are going to say, actually, this is not diesel punk at all. But, diesel punk is broadly defined as post-Victorian machine aesthetics against a backdrop of film noir and Art Deco. And when I say post-Victorian, I mean that there still is the sentimentality of the machine age, but you don't have this turn-of-the-century romantic view of trains and ocean liners and automobiles, especially not after the Titanic sunk. The view of machines is a little more greasy and utilitarian than the very utopian and very Victorian aesthetic of steampunk.
Yeah.
Indiana Jones, it's a bit cartoonish and whimsical, so maybe it's not the most accurate window into 1930s life, but it still did capture things well enough to be good, wholesome family entertainment in the 80s. Indiana Jones was allowed to make it into our propaganda because it does follow the rules of being set completely before 1939. It just cut it much closer than Hollywood usually does. If a boomer couple took their greatest generation parents and their Gen X children to an Indiana Jones movie in the 80s, or if they showed the VHS tapes to their millennial children in the 90s, like they did with me, it was a multi-generational propaganda experience. Grandma and Grandpa would say, oh yeah, this is what the world used to look like in the good old days. And Mom and Dad would get yet another dose of the story where World War II is a cartoonish battle between good and evil. And the children wouldn't question it since the 80s and 90s were still an age of good feelings. That era was the last hurrah of mass culture when propaganda still worked like a charm.
Well, there was a kink in the works. My Dito saw this, saw the swastikas, and was like, oh, the Germans are here, good. That'll put things right.
Well, I'm just saying, at least we have a baseline to build up our picture of the 30s, even if it is as silly as Indiana Jones, because it was good enough for the grandparents to have feel-good 30s nostalgia.
Especially mine.
So we are going to start in the year 1930, and we're going to start looking at the art in this world. And that's easy enough because there is one absolutely iconic painting from the year 1930. Yeah, American Gothic is clearly more of a 1930s aesthetic than a 20s aesthetic, but it's not exactly an outlier. It's an example of folk Americana called regionalism. Now, we need to build up context for why this style existed in the first place, and then we need to ask where it went. But how do Grant Wood and American Gothic fit into the story of art in 1930? Well, not to disappoint you, but Grant Wood is not as much of an outlier as you might think. We have a warped timeline because the 30s are such a black hole, and all the styles from the 20s are elevated by the official narrative. But if you just look objectively at the years when Grant Wood was active, his progression makes perfect sense. So here's the guy here. He was a Midwestern boy. He did train as a metal worker, so he wasn't some soft hands kid from the East Coast. But he was into painting as well, especially after World War I. Now, Impressionism had its market, but it was never that popular in France until after World War I and the auction of the Quinn election in 1926. Again, I'm not calling back to everything. Watch the last couple of episodes. But if you remember Paul Durand-Ruel, he was the art dealer for many of the Impressionists, and he said the Americans do not laugh at this stuff, they buy it. So Impressionism always had its appreciation in America, and the narrative talks about how this interest was boosted by the Armory Show in 1913, though if you watched our last couple of episodes, you'll see that I think that claim is somewhat overblown. But in Grant Wood's early works, you see what is clearly Impressionism, albeit with a very different palette than the bright colors of Monet and Renoir. Like, look at this. That's Impressionism.
Yeah, I like this.
Here's another one, is called The Landscape of Autumn. This is almost even more Impressionist. It's just the French artists used a bright color palette, especially Vincent van Gogh. This guy used more of an earthy, rustic choice of colors.
This looks like I'm running on a path.
Yep, absolutely.
I'm just seeing this out of the corner of my eye or something.
We're also Canadians. You go about 25 minutes out of any city, you're in the middle of this.
Even Toronto. You're never far from forest in my country.
Yeah, so Grant Wood is clearly talented, but there's nothing the least bit unusual for a young American artist to be doing works like this in the late 1910s and early 1920s. Now it's the year 2026. If any creative at any time in history had an unconventional personal life, you can guarantee there's going to be an army of PhD students from second-tier universities speculating that he was gay. And Grant Wood, he had a brief and tumultuous marriage to an older woman, and one of his colleagues tried to get him fired for his, quote, persuasions. And he certainly did have some works with undertones that we can call, let's say, homoerotic, like this one here.
Yeah.
Look at those naked men in the back.
Oh, I didn't even notice that. I was just like, homie's got a gay face.
Yeah, this is called Arnold Comes of Age.
Oh, my God. You'd be put in jail for this if you drew this.
At some times in history, yes. Yeah, maybe not now.
At other times in history, it's quite fashionable to have young boys bathing nude with dudes.
Now, there are a lot of American scholars who say that Grant Wood was a closeted homosexual, but there are American scholars who say that everybody was a closeted homo. So
it's the gay industrial complex.
Connections are made, and sometimes these connections are quite tenuous. I don't know what Grant Wood's predilections were. It's also none of my business. The important thing is that Grant Wood was very private about certain parts of his life, including 4 trips to Europe between 1920 and 1928 to be a bohemian. He may have put forth the image of this straight-laced Midwestern boy, but...
especially at the bathhouse.
Well, the 1920s in Paris were the peak of the avant-garde, where all the weird aesthetics were in style, and he was a part of that milieu.
He's swilling absinthe down at the Cafe Eye.
Yep. He just didn't make that part of his public persona, which may lend credence to the idea that he was hiding some extracurricular activities.
Michael Jackson style.
But, it would be a mistake to think that Grant Wood was in any way disconnected from the mainstream of the art world by being a country boy from Iowa.
Yeah, makes sense. It used to be art was like a very manly thing, is my understanding.
Absolutely.
Like Patton wrote poetry.
Yeah.
Because it was part of what the ideal warrior should be able to.
Well, we talked about how the Dada movement ended with a bar fight. Yeah. Literally. Yeah. That destroyed a theater.
There we go. Now you're doing art. That's punk rock.
So every time we talked about an avant-garde artist who lived in Paris, we talked about him moving there as a young man, doing an impressionist painting, then a post-impressionist painting, then a couple of more exotic movements, usually culminating in a cubist painting. Now, Grant Wood, he never had any desire to work abstract, so he never dabbled in cubism, but he still followed exactly the same progression that the rest of them did in Paris. Grant Wood was not exactly Vincent van Gogh, who cut his teeth painting the potato eaters with very drab colors and then moved to Paris, drank a lot of absinthe, and started using really bright colors to paint whatever was going through his crazy mind. his very disturbed mind.
And marrying prostitutes.
In the 20s, a lot of Grant Wood's works were homages to a lot of the famous artists from the 1880s, 1890s, and 1900s. Now, we are a year into this series, which means we're all art history experts at this point. Let's see if we can recognize the artists who he's doing homages to. This is the City Gate of Paris, which could be a Renoir painting viewed through a sepia filter. That's how I would describe that.
Yeah.
This is called Conduit, where he's clearly channeling Monet with the light coming through the trees. This is the tree on the left, and this is the Italian courtyard on the right. You see that there's black outlines around the trees in both of these. That looks like it could be straight out of Gauguin's The Yellow Christ before he moved to Tahiti.
So it's like one of these kung fu movies where he's got to learn from every master of
Yes.
various animal forms to learn.
Or Scott Pilgrim.
Oh, God. I still haven't watched that movie.
I haven't either.
I lived that movie, but I haven't watched that movie.
Then you have At Ville d'Avray. This could be in Monet's Water Lily's Garden. This could be straight out of it.
This triggered my go get my fishing rod instinct.
Yep.
I want to throw a freaking bobber in that so bad.
This is a pretty explicit homage to Vincent van Gogh. It's a little weird looking at his progression because we see all the same styles, but his palette is much more drab than Vincent van Gogh's palette was.
Because he didn't have schizophrenia.
Well, like every talented creative, he can only last so many years LARPing as a Belle Epoque era bohemian in Montmartre. And in the mid-20s, he starts experimenting with styles that are a little bit older. Not as far back as Michelangelo, but a few decades earlier to Gustave Courbet. Now, if you remember, this was our third episode, so ancient history now. Courbet was one of the first people to call himself realist, not because painters were doing anything that didn't resemble reality before that, just that he was going to be an insufferable French intellectual who was going to show you his empathy for the peasants by painting them at work.
Oh, wow.
You never picked up a hammer, Gustave.
Yeah.
Unlike Gustave Courbet, though, Grant Wood had actually done manual labor in his life. He was not some trust fund brat who got exiled from the country after he and his communist friends tried to take over Paris, unlike Courbet. Courbet may be associated with the word realism, but when Grant Wood painted men at work, it felt a lot less cartoonish.
This actually makes me be this actually shows some respect for the working people.
Yep.
The other one really doesn't. The other one's like a fetishization, doll. This really, like the little details. He's got dirty hands.
Yeah, the one on the left is called the helix welder. He knows what a helix is.
Yeah, there you go.
And the one on the right is called the product checker.
Yeah.
He knows the unsung guy in the factory.
Yeah, make sure that you don't die.
The other thing is that if you look at these paintings, you can even see the influence of the old Dutch masters.
Oh, yeah.
So by the time Grant Wood finished his last trip to Europe in the late 20s, he had spent his time studying all the greats, trying his hand at all the old styles. And I don't know why I was expecting the American Gothic guy to have a vastly different story than the rest of the artists that we look at, but he doesn't. It just feels different because the Parisian avant-garde used such vibrant colors, and Grant Wood used what the Puritans called sad colors.
Do you know who else used vibrant colors? Wesley Willis.
Yes. Yeah, he did.
He painted too, folks. He painted landscapes and cityscapes.
He painted and used his $50 synthesizer. So in 1928, Grant Wood moved back to the Midwest for good, but he was still connected to the art world. He sold his work through the same networks in New York and Chicago as everybody else did. And that brings us back to American Gothic.
Cork.
In 1930, he submitted this painting to an art show at the Art Institute of Chicago, and while he did not win first prize, this painting made him famous. Now, contrary to popular belief, This is not supposed to represent a farmer and his wife. It's supposed to represent a farmer and his daughter. And the word Gothic in the title refers to the architecture of the farmhouse in the background.
Oh, okay. I was wondering, like the chick didn't have like black lipstick on or anything.
Yeah.
The guy on the right looks like a juggalo.
It's actually the guy's dentist.
Oh God.
Yeah, actually, the model for the woman was Grant Wood's sister, and that's his dentist on the right. If you've spent any amount of time in a political forum online, you've heard of something called horseshoe theory, where people from opposite extremes of the ideological spectrum end up believing very similar things. You saw something very similar in the reception that this painting received. First of all, you had the citizens of Iowa who said that this is an unflattering and unfair depiction of us as a bunch of dour Puritans and backwards country bumpkins.
Fuck you, Iowa. Who are you lying to, Iowa?
This painting wasn't necessarily a middle finger, but they thought it was a satirical jab at them, and they just didn't appreciate it.
If only they'd lived to see the meth epidemic.
Well, the citizens of the rest of America, at least the ones from far away from Iowa, they thought this was supposed to be an appreciative and respectful depiction of the people who live this kind of lifestyle. But the horseshoe curved back on itself when people like Gertrude Stein, she said, yeah, this is brilliant. He perfectly captured the essence of these backward hicks. When good art is made immediately prior to a major historical event, it's either remembered as having foresight or it's viewed as a eulogy for something that just ended. Fight Club and The Matrix were not intended to be a time capsule of the world destroyed by 9/11, but that is exactly what they became. American Gothic ended up becoming a eulogy for an era that was coming to an end. I don't think Grant Wood knew that it was coming to an end or intended it that way, but American Gothic is an icon of the world of 1930, and that world would completely cease to exist by 1945. The world of 1930, in many ways, it was the same world that existed since the 16th century. The World War I peace settlement had changed a lot of things in Europe, but countries were still bound by decisions and wars and agreements from centuries before, going back to the Elizabethan age, which was the 1500s. We did a few episodes on that as well. But that means that we need to look deep into the past to understand the political context of the year 1930. And when I say that the political context was completely different between 1930 and 1945, I don't just mean that the old ideologies were dead, although certainly many of the old ideologies were dead.
Sorry, phrenology.
Yeah, by 1945, if you had political ambitions, it did not mean starting a political party and trying to go somewhere with it. It meant convincing the bureaucrats and the brain trust to go along with your ideas.
Good.
Going into the 30s, you could still start a political party, and if you got enough people on board to win an election, you could take control of the entire government and restaff it for a few years.
Google anti-Masonic party.
Yep. Or Know Nothing Party is another one.
All kinds,
Yeah, the 1930s art that we're going to look at, it's absolutely political in nature. Sometimes it's outright propaganda, and frequently that propaganda is communist. But it was political for a system with a completely different mechanic behind it. Completely different things were possible in 1930 than in 1945. And we need to understand the mechanics of the government in 1930 to understand the art and the propaganda of 1930. The previous era started about 100 years earlier in 1830, and it mostly ended with the World War I peace settlement, where Woodrow Wilson made Europe, quote-unquote, safe for democracy, leading, of course, to the rise of Hitler and Stalin. We spent 6 episodes talking about how the period from 1918 to 1925 was the foundation of our current age and our current culture, and it was. But there were still some holdovers and vestiges in the 1930s, and those were all finished off by World War II. In particular, there are three things that ended in the 1930s: the old mechanics of politics, workers' rights movements in any real sense, and utopian thinking. And we need to understand all three of them to understand the context in which American Gothic was painted. Now, in 2026, we are trained to think about politics. Now, in 2026, we've been trained to think about politics in terms of abstract nouns like socialism, communism, capitalism, fascism, liberalism, conservatism, nationalism, Marxism, workers' rights, anarchism, democratic, etc., etc., etc. These words are all in the common consciousness, but I don't think anybody really takes them all that seriously. You know, they get thrown around while your conservative boomer uncle and your purple-haired cousin are arguing at Thanksgiving. But, you know, that kind of politics is about as deep as cheering for the Green Bay Packers. Yep. You know, if you need to go to university, maybe you'll shoehorn a few of those words into a paper right next to the words justice and colonialism if you're sucking up to the TA. But in the current university system, those words only matter insofar as you need them to get grant money. Real ideological politics do not exist in any real practical sense in the year 2026. That's not true about 1930. We keep talking about how we've been on an auto loop since the 1920s, and I think that's just easiest to see with our political language. What new ideological labels come out of the 20th century? Libertarian. Like, libertarians have always been a bit of a joke with their political impotence, but I'm sure they're a 20th century ideology.
Yeah,
maybe
very upset with age of consent laws in my experience.
Yeah, to any libertarians listening, I know you have strong, well thought out arguments for everything, but when the age of consent comes up, let it slide. Even if your argument is airtight and logical, you don't win that argument. You never look good.
No, this is not Pakistan.
But what other ideological labels come out of the 20th century? Like maybe environmentalism? Beyond that, any ideology that comes out of the 20th century is usually titled by adding a prefix to a 19th century label, like neoconservatism, or else it's sticking two 19th century labels together, like social democrats or national socialism or liberal democracy and so forth. You know, our political debates are a total LARP as far as, you know, affecting change in the halls of power. And deep down, I think we all know it's a LARP, but what exactly are we LARPing? Well, we're LARPing the world where those labels meant something. And that world existed between about the 1830s and the 1930s. Those terms were not just abstract ideas. They all represented tangible party proposals rooted in the economic, political, religious, and industrial milieu of the Industrial Revolution. For example, when some art school socialist talks about owning the means of production in 2026, what the fuck does that even mean in a world where everybody's using 50 cell phone apps that are all hosted by Amazon on the cloud?
Yeah.
Like, it's not even a coherent idea. If you are in a smoke-filled factory town in the English Midlands in 1857, worker ownership and profit sharing are a very real and very tangible discussion.
Yep.
But that all ended with the New Deal, National Socialism, and the Soviet Union, and I guess to a lesser extent fascist Italy. We can pretend that voting matters in anything more than a superficial sense, but since the 1930s and 1940s, every country has been run by an unelected permanent bureaucracy, and the rest of us just live in it. To keep the soma flowing so that we don't get too angry, they let us have these political discussions steeped in language that were perfectly relevant to the world of 1885. It's just not 1885 anymore.
It's like the kids who are claiming, like kids who are still identifying as goths.
Exactly.
It's just it's an echo. It's like, it's a reenactment society.
Yeah, so why the 1830s? Well, many reasons, but most of them stem from the fact that industrialization had grown to the point that society just didn't function the way it used to anymore. The middle class had gotten too big and had too much wealth for the old assumptions to work. The 1830s saw the July Revolution in France, which led to the events of Les Miserables.
Can you hear the people?
Yeah, yes, yeah. Yes, that was when real politics started.
You could still brick up the roads in Paris.
Exactly, yep. Yeah, the 1830s also saw the Great Reform Act, which expanded the franchise in Britain. It saw Andrew Jackson's populism, which completely transformed the way that the federal government worked in the United States. It wasn't just a bunch of legal nerds after Andrew Jackson got his hands on the government.
For anybody who doesn't know, he was like the first Trump, basically.
Yes, he was.
He had a big party in the White House after he got elected, and all the people of ill repute who voted for him showed up. And after a few days, he had to put whiskey barrels out, and then that finally got everybody drunk enough that they passed out.
Yep.
And then he was able to go about his business. He beat an assassin with his frickin' oak or hickory cane.
Yep. They don't make them the way they used to.
No, they don't.
By the 1830s, people could now organize in large numbers, whether it was for a political cause or whether it was for a labor strike. And in the 1830s, everybody just agreed that it was time for something new. Then in 1848, all of Europe went out in populist revolutions, and most of those revolutions failed, but...
those fuckers didn't have armies.
No, they didn't. Most of those revolutions failed, but most of them still resulted in some sort of a democratic concession where the monarchs limited their own power. By the early 20th century, industry had really taken off, especially due to the Bessemer process of producing steel. And by that point, the middle class was big enough that if you could organize a political party and convince a lot of people to hop on your bandwagon, and if you could fundraise or have a rich person get on board with your cause, you could gain complete control of the levers of power, at least until the next election cycle. You did not have a permanent bureaucracy to deal with. Of course, this was not due to any sort of benevolence. It's just because technology wasn't yet at the point, especially communications technology, where a bureaucracy could micromanage every aspect of people's lives. That started to change between about the 1920s and 1940s as operations scaled to the complexity where one rich guy just couldn't invest all the money and own the operation himself. You know, one person, no matter how rich he was, couldn't front the money to build the railroads. So finance had to work differently.
Yeah.
Politics started to change accordingly, especially as companies like General Electric needed to work hand in hand with the government to make sure that the electrical grid worked properly.
Those were the days.
Yeah, another inconvenient fact is just how much General Electric built out the infrastructure during Stalin's 5-year plan. Next episode, we will get to that. Probably the last echo of the old system in American culture was Citizen Kane in 1941, which was a retrospective of this transition. I'm sure you've seen this famous picture. If you've never seen the movie, Kane is a composite of a few magnates, particularly William Randolph Hearst. In particular, Kane is a stand-in for Hearst using yellow journalism to drum up support for the Spanish-American War. The movie starts with him dying as an old man and a newsreel retrospective of his rise and fall, starting in 1895, going through the crash of 1929, when he had to sell his major newspaper because he didn't have the cash on hand. Then during the 30s, he retreated from public life into his gigantic mansion in Florida. How is that relevant to the modern world? He got called both a communist and a fascist until he died in 1941. So this is exactly the period that we're trying to understand, but this movie was the last vestige of it.
Okay.
In the movie, Kane tried to enter politics and run for governor of New York as the champion of the working man. He called himself a fighting liberal, but he was caught up in a sex scandal, which ended his political career.
I'm just glad that there's no perverted oligarchs now pulling the strings.
It just doesn't ruin their political careers anymore. That's the only difference. Often it helps.
Yep.
So this is the age when a rich guy could buy up newspapers and manipulate public opinion, but he also wasn't powerful enough to control the narrative when a rival could print headlines about him.
Yeah. Unlike the guy who can dick with the algorithm.
Exactly. Politics was full of money, as politics has always been full of money and always will be full of money. But no one person was so rich that he could buy up the entire democratic process as corporate America was able to do after World War II. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, do you think you could get any politician to resign by getting a major newspaper to write salacious stories about his social life? They just don't care.
Day one, the intelligence agencies leaked a report that Trump was apparently getting peed on by Russian hookers.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's true or false. I'm just saying nobody cared.
Nobody cared. Nobody cares. Well, the only reason that his base cares about the Epstein thing is they're all freaking thought that he was going to be the champion against the evil people running the show secretly, and then they found out, oh wait, he was going to the freaking Eyes Wide Shut shit.
Certain boomers are based, and I love you guys, but if Q was a real person, he would not be using mass media to transmit things. It would be done on a back channel on Discord, or probably some even newer technology that I've never heard of.
Or you go on Joe Rogan.
I can believe that there's some weird guy in the back catacombs of Washington somewhere. I can't believe that he's using mass media channels.
Yeah.
So, politics nowadays is all theater anyways, so, it's just a different world. That transition happened between 1930 and 1945, even though it took a few decades to completely degenerate to the point where the government's top priority is now transsexuals. But there is one scene in the movie that really gets to the core of the old world. I don't think that Orson Welles intended for it to be symbolic of this shift, because I don't think you knew it was a shift until you look at it in hindsight, but it was. At one point, Kane gets warned by his intoxicated associate that he wants to buy the public's support by being the reformer who gives them rights. But what's going to happen when the workers decide to get involved with a workers' rights party and decide for themselves what they want? That is a conversation that made sense in the 1930s. But as far as organized labor having a real voice in the political arena in 2026, that ship sailed, and it sailed a long fucking time ago.
Yeah, rip unions. Sorry, guys.
And even when unions still had some leverage over their employers before their employers just moved the factory to Mexico, they didn't have leverage in the political arena. That ended in the 30s.
Well, it's like every union is like you have to hire some guy with a master's degree to run
exactly.
it. Exactly. You need that.
Well, before moving on, I just need to note one other thing. Note that even though American politics was still a two-party system in the 30s, you just don't see this left-wing, right-wing dichotomy. All three of those factions are things that you would call left-wing today. The fighting liberal, the machine politician working on behalf of an ethnic interest group, and the workers' rights movement.
Democrats too.
Exactly. But they don't say what party these people belong to. Technology did not yet exist to allow anybody to organize on a national scale, so politics was fundamentally different. And there were many different factions who believed, or at least claimed to believe, that they spoke for the masses and knew what was best for the country.
And they were choke points because of the way the media worked.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. And Kane, the guy who owned the newspaper, was emblematic of that. These days, we have a lot of words which all seem to describe the same thing: socialism, anarchism, political correctness, communism, decolonization, woke, social justice, civic nationalism, secular humanism, progressivism. Politics is just that much of a LARP. You have 8 different labels and people argue which label they want to give themselves. They're all the same shit. It's all the same group of people. Between 1830 and 1930, all of those words describe different political factions. There were lots of left-wing factions and lots of right-wing factions, and they all hated each other, even within the left and within the right. If we just limit ourselves to the United States, all of the left-wing factions and all the right-wing factions were vying for the nomination of one of the major parties, or sometimes these ideologies would get factions in both parties, most successfully the progressives of the early 20th century. But it just, politics was real then, it's fake and gay now. You know, the fact that Trump was able to insult Rosie O'Donnell all the way to the White House, that just shows you how rotten the system is. That doesn't mean Trump's a reformer.
That broke her brain. She moved to Ireland. She thinks Trump's going to Handmaid's Tale. Rosie, you are not off-red. Don't worry.
No.
No one's going to put you in a...
You know, they all believe that they're going to be the women wearing the red robes, the ones who are used as the breeding cattle.
Nope.
They don't believe they're the women who are going to be wearing gray, who have to fucking sweep the floor.
Scrubbing the floor. All...
Just that is the biggest tell, is that they always show up to these protests wearing the red robes.
Yeah, it's never the working class. Always the party.
So, this period, it was not just the period of Hearst and the gas lamps and Sherlock Holmes. America has always been a fertile ground for radicalism and utopianism. And the 1890s and the early 20th century were a bumper crop of that stuff.
It's like a Great Awakening kind of situation.
Yeah, it was the Third Great Awakening. Because industrialization had, said, all right, utopia is going to finally work this time.
We got it, boys. We got it figured out. Now, pay no attention to those starving Ukrainians. I don't see any starving Ukrainians.
Yes.
Yeah, literally, yes.
Well, we are going to talk a little bit more about that in the next episode, when we look at Hitler and Stalin a little more explicitly, but yes. The New Republic, that publication is still around today. If you read Eugene Lyons's account of the 30s, he said there was no atrocity that Stalin could commit so big that the New Republic would run interference for him.
Well, and they apparently, I think if I'm remembering this portion of history correctly, they'd set up like fake cities.
Yeah, the Potemkin villages. Yeah.
Like, look at how happy the peasant. No one's starving to death.
So Eugene Lyons, he was a Russian Jew who moved to America and then became a journalist and moved back to Moscow to be stationed there.
Oh, okay.
And he talked about how the Russians looked at the Americans who came in, saying, wow, just look at so many people willing to starve for the revolution. This is an inspiration. And the Russians like, are Americans always retarded? It was like an episode of South Park. It was that level. We'll talk a lot more about that in the next episode. Yeah, Yankee Puritans have always had a taste for radicalism. The country started in a tax revolt, but 1776 was far from the first time that the mob got violent in colonial America. Also, most American founding stock was nonconformist Protestant, Puritan or otherwise. The American masses have always viewed themselves as traditionalist and conservative, but it's hard to say what conservative means in a country whose founding myth is based on a religious group called the Nonconformists starting a secessionary war.
Yeah.
Like,
monarchy's out of the question.
No. So that said, late 19th century radicalism was a distinctly European import brought in during the 1870s. In continental Europe, where there wasn't a lot of space in your cramped factory town, agitating for change was often an appealing option for the unwashed masses, whether that took the form of labor strikes or whether that took the form of political organization. In America, you could just say, fuck it, buy a railroad ticket to a frontier town and buy more property than your ancestors could ever dream of.
Yep.
So there was a moderating effect for most of the 19th century in America.
Yep.
So political radicalism based on labor rights was just a non-starter, but the Americans had the market cornered on a different kind of fanaticism, and that's millenarianism.
Oh, these guys.
Yeah, we talk about how the political situation changed in the 1830s, but on the cultural front, the 1830s were also the Second Great Awakening, when the entire nature of American religion changed to a less doctrinal and more revivalist model. 1830 America was when they came up with ideas that you might think are much older, like the rapture. And since the Second Great Awakening, it has never been unusual to hear some fanatical Yankee pietist talking about how he's analyzed Scripture and determined that Jesus is coming back next Tuesday at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Yeah, it happened not that long ago. Remember all those, well, I guess at this point, 10 years ago at this point, the guy was like, oh, the 2016 is going to be the last year. It was just some radio preacher.
Okay.
I
didn't know that.
He got old enough that he went crazy, and he told his flock that, like, no, I figured out when Jesus come back, so make sure you max out all your credit cards to put advertisements everywhere to tell the people to repent. And this is just like the freaking cicadas coming out in America.
Yep. Yes, it is.
It's just culture.
Yeah, it's part of the fabric.
Yep.
Yeah, I guess these people just interpret "you shall not know the day or the hour" as I'm the exception to that rule.
Do you know what the fucking Miller said when they called him out on that?
What did he
I'm not saying the day or the hour. I'm saying the year.
Of course. Puritan culture is especially susceptible to radicalism because it's not geographically tied anywhere. First, it was based in East Anglia, then it was based in New England. Then by the 1830s, it had shifted to western New York State, near Buffalo, where you had so many crazy revivalist and millenarian Protestant offshoots that they called it the Burned Over District. This is where you got the Mormons and the Millerites and a handful of utopian communities like the Oneidas, and you had the genesis of feminism at Seneca Falls.
And this is also when some wackadoo pointed out that Israel, it says praise Israel in the Bible.
This is dispensationalist as its root.
And that you may not have heard of dispensationalism, but it's why both political parties in the States fillet Israel every election. It's because a good chunk of the evangelicals in the States think that Israel has to be there so that the end times can come. And that comes out of this David's 100 years or something.
Daniel, but
Daniel, 100 days or whatever.
Yeah.
Which is like the wackiest interpretation of the Bible ever. The guy was like, oh, there's numerical codes in Daniel, and Israel's going to...
Yeah, he said, there's a certain number of years, and then there's this one passage in Leviticus or Deuteronomy or something that says, if you're extra bad, your punishment is going to be multiplied by 7, so we have to multiply this number by 7 as well. Also, it says that to bring on the apocalypse or to bring on the millennium, whatever they believe in, there has to be a cow that has only red hair. So they are working on genetically modifying a cow with red hair.
Yeah,
I wish I was making that up. I'm not.
Humanity, folks.
Yeah.
This is where we're at. We have nuclear weapons.
Yeah. So, again, all this shit comes out of the Burnt Over District. This is also where you get the first spiritualists running seances.
Yeah.
You also get the Shakers, who aren't around anymore because they preach celibacy, and that only works for so many generations.
Yep.
All of these weird Protestant sects from upstate New York seem to have followed the same formula, where you have a charismatic low church leader claiming to have read the Bible and discovering the divine secret to building New Jerusalem. And the Puritans have been doing this since John Knox. That's nothing new. But if they were deemed to be too crazy, as in the case of the Mormons, they just moved to Utah and made that the center of their fanaticism.
Yep.
A lot of stuff in American religion just wouldn't have worked without the frontier.
Yep. Just going on. But so basically, this is like early YouTube. You have all these freaking scumbags that have just been unleashed.
Yep.
These scumbag con artists.
Yep.
That are just freaking unleashed on a credulous population. desperate to believe in something.
Yep.
And so much of the modern world is still dependent on things that happen.
And keep in mind, those crazy groups that I just listed, they're the ones that survivorship bias their way through.
Yep.
Just think of how many cults fell apart after the charismatic leader died.
Yep.
So, it was a match made in hell when a bunch of German emigres showed up in American cities in the 1870s carrying pamphlets written by Marx and Nietzsche. And they assimilated with the Yankee Calvinists, who have always been susceptible to the idea that educated people should be the ones creating the Uberman.
It's better than the Pope.
It's like the Yankee Puritans, they believe in an egalitarian society where they should be the ones managing it, because some animals are more equal than others.
Yep.
Yeah, so early 20th century communist organizations tended to have a small number of WASPs in charge of a large number of Eastern European immigrants, many of whom belong to a certain, shall we say, ethno-religious group that has been at the center of a number of 20th century geopolitical controversies.
This would not go unnoticed by an Austrian painter.
Well, so combine this Puritanism with the rapid industrial progress of the late 19th century and the political environment where any movement can gain power if it's big enough. And America probably had a dozen politically viable utopian movements in the year 1900. In a previous episode, we also mentioned Edward Bellamy's 1888 proto-science fiction novel, Looking Backward, about a utopian society where the United States had been turned into a single industrial corporation with centralized resource management, a post-scarcity mindset, everyone retiring at 45, gender equality, no money, and a flowering of the arts, because these people always believe that their ideas are going to usher in the next Renaissance.
Yep.
That's the one constant.
If you're curious what it was like growing up in the 90s, we thought we were about to get this.
Then 9/11.
Wait, what's that?
Again.
Okay.
But the book Looking Backward was the bestseller in its day, and it became instantly synonymous with industrial utopianism for the next 50 years until World War II. Arguably, it became the template for the Soviet Union, where the ideas turned out not to mesh with reality quite so well. Shall we say?
You'll notice Star Trek never really wants to get into the economic system of Star Trek. They always kind of leave that blank.
Well, exactly. No, this book is absolutely a precursor to Star Trek. I mean, Roddenberry.
Utopianism. Yeah. It's that religious. This has a religious origin. This has that millennialist form.
Absolutely, yeah. Roddenberry was a member of the Greatest Generation. There's no way he wasn't aware of this. There are a lot of things in Star Trek that require a suspension of disbelief, as you say, but none more so than the idea that a utopian civilization based on American egalitarian principles could ever produce a British aristocratic gentleman like Picard.
Yeah.
That's just not going to happen.
Yep.
Picard does not come out of the United States. A lot of cosplayers come out of the United States. But yeah, you can draw a straight line from Picard right back to Bellamy's book from the 1880s. In fact, you can probably even draw a straight line back to the levelers in the English Civil War 400 years earlier.
It's another episode coming down the pipe, folks. We're going to talk about the levelers.
Yeah, so the age of American industrial utopianism starts with Bellamy's book in the late 1880s and the social gospel in the 1890s. Another thing that came out of the burnt-over district, by the way. That age started in the 1880s. It went through the red decade in the 1930s when everyone who was anyone, was either communist or at least sympathetic towards communism, at least in New York's high society.
That's why you had to have the 50s. That fucking shit sorted.
Well, that age ended rather abruptly when Stalin revealed how much contempt he had for the American intelligentsia by entering into a pact with Hitler and not telling them. A more homegrown American version of utopianism in the 1930s was the technocracy movement, saying that engineers should run society instead of politicians. This idea spread to Canada, where technocracy had to be made illegal during World War II. And one person who was arrested for being a technocrat, Elon Musk's grandfather.
Hey! There we go.
It's like, discovering that the descendant of a famous general is now a famous investment banker. We could spend an entire episode on the utopian nature of the American Puritans, but the thing to understand is that utopianism never really went anywhere. It was there before the age when everyone was gung-ho on industrialism. It's still there now. Just look at the number of self-loathing politicians genuflecting to BLM. It's just a part of WASP culture. It's been there for at least 200 years, probably longer than that.
Robertson Davies called it bred in the bone.
Yep. Yeah, I said that the remainder of this series is going to be one united story arc from the 30s to the 60s, instead of the usual narrative which treats World War II as a breaking point. A huge part of that cultural continuity comes from exploring how Puritan utopianism morphed into other forms, most obviously Star Trek.
And that, became, if you really get into it with your modern day communists, they watch Star Trek in the 90s. That's almost always what it comes down to, is this, I'll think about, it's not the writings of Marx. It's not, it's not necessarily social pressure. They got this utopian idea that there will be a day when they're just going to be able to write fan fiction and get everything from a replicator.
Yep. And they cite Star Trek, some of them, as their arguments for why something's immoral.
Yes, they do.
You might say Star Trek is a holy text.
Yep, I would agree to that for the modern science utopians. But again, it predates. Goes back to this book you're talking about.
Well, if you want to see how much the culture of today's universities is just New England Protestant culture, one of the crown jewels of the Second Great Awakening was a utopian commune called Brook Farm.
No.
Now, Nathaniel Hawthorne, the guy who wrote The Scarlet Letter, the book about Puritans in colonial Massachusetts, he also wrote a novel about his time at Brook Farm. It was called The Blithedale Romance, and the characters in that book are indistinguishable from 1960s hippies. Indistinguishable.
Okay.
Hippie culture is just Puritan culture.
Yeah, they were originally, they called them the Jesus Freaks.
Yep.
They were, a lot of them ended up drifting into other cults and religious movements.
Some of them drifted out to California and found a hobo-looking guy with a swastika forehead, with a swastika tattoo on his forehead.
That was later, but he got that in jail. He was trying to impress the AB. But yeah, basically the hippies are a really fascinating manifestation of American utopianism. You had all these, almost like a children's crusade of all these kids marching off to San Francisco. There's suddenly not enough resources to support this lifestyle of these parasites sleeping in the park. Mm-hmm. And so what do? Well, these various bizarre characters lead them off into communes.
Yep.
And some of them just become weird sex communes, and some of them are Charles Manson. Mm-hmm. So anyway.
Yeah, well, I just say we lovingly rip on the boomers here, but the boomers are really just the final boss of this vacuous Puritan culture.
Yeah.
And just in case you think it's an aberration that Nathaniel Hawthorne, one of the authors we're forced to read, one of the authors we were forced to read when we were taught proper literature.
He was the white guy. He was too white.
Yeah, just in case you think it's an aberration that guy was involved in this colony, when you have a group of pompous intellectuals, you always get a slap fight. And sure enough, Brook Farm got into a slap fight with another utopian commune called Fruitlands, founded by the father of Louisa May Alcott. These people can all sit around a table.
It's like you were telling me everybody with Trump was as part of a cousinage.
Yes.
In the States.
Trump is, I think, the first president not to descend from the Mayflower. Yeah. That includes Obama, by the way.
White mama. Absent father.
The real question is, was Brook Farm successful? And the answer is sort of.
Oh.
As a community where men and women did equal work, producing farm products and handmade goods, the answer is no. It was a miserable failure at that.
Communists can't make anything.
But as a community of rich New Englanders who also ran a school that charged overpriced fees,
there we go.
It was quite successful in that regard.
The Montessori.
Some things never change.
Yeah.
So how did Brook Farm come to an end? Well, they started work on a gigantic structure called phalanstery, which was a portmanteau of phalanx and monastery, which tells you all you need to know about the insufferable people involved.
So they were trying to build a Borg cube?
Well, the phalanstery burned down.
Good.
And when your utopian Tower of Babel burns down, you pick yourself up, you take a deep breath, and you ask yourself that most important of all questions. We had insurance, right? And when the answer is no,
oh my,
it's America, so you say, well, at least we had gender equality. Now, Brook Farm was a joint stock company where everyone was only required to put in a fixed number of hours every week. It had, as I said, complete gender equality. Everyone was expected to have ample time for intellectual pursuits. Does that sound familiar? Oh yeah, that's the exact model that Edward Bellamy wrote about 45 years later in Looking Backward. It's the exact model of Star Trek.
Yep, these are the guys who... Yep. So this is the Trekkies.
Yep.
They're just going to live there.
Well, when Bellamy came around, it was just, we have electricity, steel, and concrete now, so not only will it work this time, it's going to work on a national scale.
Oh.
So everything about boomer culture, from the hippies to Star Trek to second-wave feminism, came from one utopian community on the outskirts of Boston in the 1840s. While Yankee Protestantism was at its most fanatical, high on the fumes of the Second Great Awakening.
Okay. Yeah, another thing that keeps coming up is, like, in these cults and these religious movements in the States, is this incredible importance placed on women.
At least the Puritans, yeah?
Yeah, the pure big time. And there was a lot of argument for women being spiritually equal. If we're all equal, they're not equal politically or financially, but they're going to be equal spiritually. That was a big debate.
So we have three threads that all come to an end in the 1930s. You have the old political system, workers' rights political movements, and industrial utopianism. How do we tie all three of them together? Well, again, it's easy to look at things through the bias of 2026 when workers' rights is a joke. What are you going to do? Organize a general strike for all the workers who got laid off when the factory was shipped to China?
Yep.
The labor relations movement seems to be full of HR ladies on anxiety meds who have never seen a day of manual labor in their life.
All of whom seem to be going to these Gaza protests with their union flags.
Yep.
Now, I spent 15 years trying to organize bouncers and security guards into unions, and very few of them wanted to be involved in it for various reasons, but largely because these unions are seen as these alien entities that don't actually stick up for their interests, that are into these weird left-wing causes.
Mm-hmm.
So, thanks, guys.
Yep. Well, that ended in the 30s.
Yeah.
At least the proper, real unions ended in the 30s.
Yeah. I was chasing an echo.
Yeah. Like the most influential unions, they seem to represent skinny, fat people with office jobs.
Yep. You got, like I said, you got any union you want. You got to be run by a guy with a master's in labor relations. Which is, have you seen people with a master's in labor relations? This is not like, these people don't have the guys down working the line down at the box factory. Their interests are not represented by a guy making $100,000 a year sitting in an office. Like, if he's not next to the corrugator in a hot summer day, packing boxes or moving corrugate, he's not going to understand what these guys go through.
Well, exactly. At best, organized labor is a group of corporate lawyers hashing out a collective bargaining agreement.
At best.
And that's rare.
Yep.
Whatever organized labor is, it just has a very academic feel in the year of our Lord 2026.
Yep.
So organized labor is dead in 2026, but 100 years ago it was very different. The International Workers of the World, the IWW, was founded in 1905 in Chicago, and it could throw its weight around politically. You had the Pullman strike in 1894 and the Seattle General Strike in 1919. They were both quite militant in nature, and they were serious enough to cause political change.
Well, and another example is the Cop Putsch.
Yep.
I believe it was the early 1920s, the same period. The German military tried to take control of the country again because it was being mismanaged during Weimar.
Oh, yeah.
And the unions had a general strike, and the army had to back down.
Yep. Again, that could happen then. It can't happen now.
Couldn't even happen, 10, 20 years later in Germany.
Yep. The 30s was just the high watermark for labor's influence in the political arena. There were strong unions for a few decades after World War II. That's why some boomers have pensions.
Yep. You're welcome, boomers.
But the game was different. Now you have a vast industrialized economy integrated with a huge permanent government bureaucracy where one hand washes the other. Mm-hmm. The military industrial complex and the welfare industrial complex are gigantic, and they can't be displaced by organizing or voting.
It's functional. It's functional dysfunction. It's load-bearing corruption.
Yeah, the labor movement, it's lost its playbook. What's it going to do? At least in the political arena. It still has an arrow in its quiver, and that's to organize strikes, but offshoring and automation have taken a nice little chunk out of that power as well.
Yep.
In some cases, more than a little chunk.
And the only group of people that could potentially pull this off are the public sector unions. And all the workers hate them because they see them as parasites on their tax dollars.
Well, that's just it. Look, I have no problem with the air traffic controllers going on strike. A high-skilled, high-stress occupation that props up the economy. They should probably be able to negotiate on their own terms. That's no different in spirit than an old craftsman's guild. But the largest unions seem to be these gigantic fucking public sector unions that represent the diversity hires in government.
Yeah.
We need to protect your make-work jobs. But yeah.
Well, again, when you see OPSU in Ontario marching with the Gaza protesters, what message is that send? Like that you're worried about getting me a pension? No.
Well, the public sector union just seems like the ultimate example of the old joke that the bureaucracy needs to grow to meet the needs of the growing bureaucracy. Yep. Before World War II, workers' rights movements were driven by real politics and real history. People may have disagreed on solutions, but everybody within the midst of industrialization could see these tangible issues. Now, organized labor seems to be passively riding the undercurrents of financialization, and a mindlessly growing bureaucracy and this obsession with efficiency.
Yep.
Now, there's one word that everybody throws around, especially in the academy, even though the word seems to be completely devoid of any meaning whatsoever. And that word is socialism. Socialism is yet another idea that comes out of the 1830s, but it seems to mean something completely different every few decades. Is socialism workers owning the means of production? Is socialism identifying with your class before your country? Is socialism communism light? Is it the Nordic model? Is it the welfare state? What is this?
Very nebulous.
By the 1930s, the two most notorious dictators in the world are running very different genocidal organizations, one called the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and the other called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So at some point between the 1830s and the 1930s, the plot was lost. Every trust fund kid still tries to toss around the word socialism to look intelligent, but forget real socialism has never been tried. Real socialism has never been defined. I could do an entire episode on this mercurial concept called socialism, and maybe I will do an episode like that when How Art Got Ugly is finished, but I don't want to lose the plot either. And this is first and foremost an art history story. So the 1890s and 1900s were the age of social gospel, and there was an associated minor American art movement called social realism, or the Ashcan School, which was basically just poverty porn set in New York.
So like American Dickens?
Like this. This could be a screen capture from The Godfather.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's like the ward. Notice the hanging chickens in the background.
Well,
right side there.
If you ever had a teacher force you to read How the Other Half Lives, full of prose and photography about the slums of New York City, that book came out in 1890. Like social realism was rehashed in the 1830s, but it kind of had two iterations. One in the 1890s, which is this, and one in the 1930s with artists like Ben Shahn.
Please, sir, may I have some more?
Yeah, he did stuff like this. Grant Wood and American Gothic are sometimes lumped in with the social realists, but he's usually considered part of the other 1930s art movement, regionalism, which was folk Americana. Well, we'll talk a little bit more about the regionalists in a bit, but the dividing line between the regionalists and the social realists was thin and shimmering, so you had a lot of artists who could be classified as both. During the New Deal's federal arts program, the social realists and the regionalists were also lumped together, sometimes under the category of the American scene.
Okay.
Let's not mince words. This stuff is propaganda for socialism. But what version of socialism was this propagandizing, and what did socialism morph into? Because when the official art history narrative became entrenched in universities in the 60s and 70s, why does it tell a story that jumps straight from the Paris Expo in 1925 to Jackson Pollock in 1942? Why does it skip over this stuff? And to answer that question, we just need to understand what the word socialism evolves into over this point. This series is called How Art Got Ugly. It's just as important to understand why this art disappears as it is to understand what Pollock was smoking and or drinking when he was jizzing on the canvas. From there on out, the story's easy. From 1945 onwards, you have the same cycle repeating, the toilet paper circling the bowl with the turd after you flush. Jackson Pollock drips paint on a canvas. His retarded art critic friends, we're using that word a lot this episode.
Yeah, why not?
His retarded art critic friends would write essays about why he's a genius. Those essays would spread around certain circles in New York City until some reporter for the New York Times or Time magazine would write a feature story on him, and the cycle would repeat every time the elites decided to latch on to a new hideous art style and find a new golden boy from Andy Warhol to Basquiat. So the first question is, what version of socialism was this poverty porn trying to propagandize? And look, in case you think I'm being facetious by saying that the word socialism has never had a coherent definition since it was coined in the 1830s, I'm going to give you two examples, a century apart, of two prominent socialists acknowledging that the word doesn't seem to mean anything. We need to understand the linguistic game before we can answer that question. Example number one is Pierre Leroux. Now, this man is a French intellectual if I've ever seen one.
Yeah, holy shit. He looks like he should be manning a barricade in the freaking Les Miserables.
It's likely that the term socialism was coined independently by multiple people in the 1820s and 30s, but he was certainly one of the most important when he coined it in an 1834 essay called Individualism and Socialism. Once again, we see that everything is rooted in the 1830s. Every history of organized labor and left-wing politics frames socialism as this long, gradual process that starts with the factory workers under the thumb of some evil industrialist. And this story always ends with labor getting together to demand a 5-day work week and no more 6-year-olds climbing into the machines. That narrative gets the causality completely backwards. Socialism is completely a product of the political reforms of the 1830s in France, Britain, and the United States. Before the 1830 reforms, you certainly had these egalitarian ideas. They didn't go away after the French Revolution in 1789, but there was no political system for those ideas to fit into. The academic narrative loves to stretch things back to the Luddites, who are in the 1810s, but the 1810s and the 1830s were two completely different worlds, every bit as much as 1930 was a different world than 1945. The Luddites would smash the factory machines that they were worried would put them out of a job, and they would collectively write letters under the pseudonym Ned Ludd, but there was no inkling that there was going to be a political solution. The idea of organized labor in the political arena just didn't make sense until the reforms of the 1830s changed the game itself. The other thing that was seen before 1830 was utopian communities. similar to the one we saw at Brook Farm, even though Brook Farm was in the 1840s. One of the more famous utopians was a man named Robert Owen, who made his fortune running a textile mill at New Lanark in a more philanthropic manner, and then he moved to America to try to set up another one of these utopian communes called New Harmony in Indiana, which he envisioned to look like this. Yeah, that's Star Trek shit.
Yeah.
New Harmony lasted for a few years, but it fell apart, as all utopias do. Another one of these utopians was a man named Charles Fourier, who beat Le Corbusier by a century when it came to architects who thought they were going to solve all of humanity's problems with their new building designs. He was the one who came up with the idea of the phalanstery, who we talked about with Brook Farm. This is what it was supposed to be. The phalanstery, it was supposed to be a large building where everyone lived communally, incorporating both rural and urban elements, and proving that his ideas were perhaps a little fantastical. He said that living in a phalanstery would force Jews to do manual labor.
Who will till the fields? The Jews.
But the most important one of these utopians was Henri de Saint-Simon. Saint-Simon predated the word socialism, but he was the one who conceived of dividing society into the working class and the idling class. And Saint-Simonianism was the core of an idea that some people think is socialist or communist or whatever. The idea that workers should own the means of production. That's where that comes from. Thomas Carlyle referred to the Saint-Simonians as a secular cult, which proved that the French still had Catholic instincts, no matter how atheist they claimed to be.
Yeah.
And that brings us back to Pierre Leroux, the man who coined the term socialism because he was a member of the Saint-Simonians. Leroux's definition of the word socialist was like the word Methodist or pagan, or if we're talking along the lines of art history, impressionist. It was coined negatively, but it didn't take long before people were wearing the label proudly, including eventually Leroux himself. After 1830, the Saint-Simonians had to figure out how their little cult of workers owning the means of production would fit into this new political system. And that's what inspired Leroux to write Individualism and Socialism in 1834. Now, the upshot of that essay was, I'm unabashedly a left-winger, but we have some problems on the left that we really need to address. Two things. First of all, we need to establish what left-wing means in the year 1830. Secondly, as we will shortly see, all of the pitfalls he warned us about have come to fruition many times over. In 1834, left-wing means something very specific and something very tangible. Leroux looks back on the last few centuries and says, first we had the age of the Catholic Church, then we had the age of the Protestants, then we had the age of the philosophers, and now we have the age of democracy, capitalism, and liberalism. And he was absolutely right about that. But he straight up said that he did not want to go back to the age of Catholicism. And left-wing means moving forward in that progression, moving along that gradient from Catholic to Protestant to secular. Leroux had zero desire to go back a step, and yes, you could expect, or at least command, men to have a lot more honor in the Catholic days, but Leroux thought that the minuses outweighed the pluses, and besides, he said that even if we rolled things back, what would stop the same mindset of the Catholic days from creating another Protestant era, which would bring us back here again? The other way in which he's an unabashed left-winger is that he wants to get rid of this concept of the great chain of being.
Good.
The concept of the great chain of being is like the Holy Roman Empire. It feels like it's something from the Middle Ages that ended centuries ago, but it was still around in the time of Napoleon.
Yeah.
Now, there have been a lot of political, religious, economic, and social reforms throughout history. Why were the 1830s so special? I think it's because if you looked around in the 1830s, you saw a world where factory owners, industrialists, merchants, and bankers were building society, and the monarchy had to remain hands-off because it was just too complex for one person to understand everything.
Yep.
The Great Chain of Being was just not an origin myth that explained anything about this brave new world. Like, when an origin myth is no longer fit for purpose, it no longer inspires hearts and minds, and the Great Chain of Being had been there since Plato and Aristotle. It was able to underpin all sorts of metaphysical philosophy, no matter how the world changed over the centuries. It was used to justify monarchical authority and to portray the universe as ordered and beautiful and unchanging. It was used to justify a lot of things. Now, that idea was not completely discarded until the late 19th and early 20th century, but it was in the 1830s and 1840s that the next worst thing happened to a religious idea, which is that it got materialized and secularized. Because there were two rapidly developing fields of science that did not exactly sit well with the idea of a static great chain of being: geology and evolutionary biology. Both involved a lot of studying fossils and realizing that there was not exactly a static chain that spanned the Earth's history. In fact, in this period, scientists tried to shoehorn things into the metaphor of the Great Chain when they coined the term missing link to explain gaps in the fossil record.
Okay.
If you remember the golden age of the New Atheist movement in the early 2000s, there were a lot of highly performative debates between Christopher Hitchens or Richard Dawkins and some Southern American evangelical theologian, usually centering on how evolution disproves the existence of God. That whole spectacle was just a rehash of the mid-19th century, when intellectuals were having the exact same debate about how evolution disproved the Great Chain of Being.
It was Scopes was like what, 18?
No, that was 1920s. Yeah. Like, everything comes out of the 1920s, including the Scopes trial.
But we're seeing the foundation of that debate laid here. It just came to a head years later in the 20s.
Yeah, well, obviously the crucial event in that timeline was Darwin publishing The Origin of Species. And no matter how religious you are or how secular you are, it's hard to say that every species on Earth belongs to a divinely inspired chain when science says that evolution happens due to random mutations and changes in the environment. It's even harder to say that the chain is static. But even before Darwin became famous, English philosopher Herbert Spencer was talking about social progress as being adaptive and evolutionary rather than divinely inspired. Some people say that he extended Darwin's ideas to some rather spicy takes on how society should be organized around race. But that interpretation misses the big picture. The big picture is that he changed the Great Chain of Being from something divinely inspired to something scientific and worldly. And even his ideas were tossed out in the early 20th century. Going back to Leroux's essay again, he's trying to make sense of this newly mechanized, industrialized world, and he doesn't have all the answers in the 1830s, but he says that whatever solution he supports, he is not going to appeal to anything that resembles the Great Chain of Being. He sees the post-1830 left wing as being on a spectrum where you don't want to go too far to either side. On one end of the left-wing spectrum, you have individualism, which he believes that the English have overdone with laissez-faire. Yeah, that wasn't always a right-wing idea, guys.
Wow.
And on the other end, you have socialism, which is a negative term that he makes up to describe people who want the state to grow to the point where it chokes off all evil in the world. And in language that was very typical of the day, Leroux says that you need to protect both liberty and society. The individualists try so hard to protect liberty that it becomes every man for himself, and the masses live in poverty because all wealth ends up in a small number of hands. Leroux points out that this arrangement doesn't even work on its own terms, because even if you support that system on moral grounds, liberty only lasts until you're dealing with a bunch of miscreants and scam artists coming in to abuse this freedom. How is that relevant to Canada in the current day? But Leroux also says that the socialists are equally wrong because they try so hard to preserve society that they put all sorts of rules in place, and completely suck the humanity out of everything. Also in the world of 2026, I can't see what's wrong about that either. LaRue doesn't exactly offer any solutions in this essay, but he at least has the self-awareness to say that the left wing is stuck between Scylla and Charybdis, where both options are bad. Individualists are always talking about the equality of men, but their solutions lead to complete inequality and, quote, a sewer of vice, suffering, immorality, and crime. How is that relevant to the modern day?
How's that relevant to Toronto?
How's that relevant to every major urban center these days? On the other hand, the socialists talk about liberty, but they turn around and speak of organizing society in regiments of scientists and regiments of industrialists, eventually declaring against liberty of thought. Ultimately, from the vantage point of 2026, history has shown that LaRue was wrong. It was not a choice of two bad options because we now live in a world where both extremes are turbocharged.
Yep. Thank you, social media.
So that's the origin of the term socialism. It was supposed to be a pejorative, but as I said, lots of people, including LaRue himself, started calling themselves socialists. How did that happen? Well, LaRue was one of the first examples of what became a proud French tradition in the 1830 world. The public intellectual who gets on board with a political movement, gains enough of a following that the group actually starts getting traction and says, fuck it, I came up with a better, newer philosophy. See you guys later.
Jesus.
Within less than 5 years, LaRue broke from the Saint-Simonians and became one of the founding thinkers of yet another political movement that was tangible in the 19th century, but yet another abstract academic term in the 20th century, humanitarianism.
Jesus, homie's laying some eggs.
Yeah, well, again, our politics is just such a LARP that all of the language comes from a system where these terms made sense, but that system has long since ended.
Like bike lanes in Canada.
Yep. In 1850, LaRue commented on his own essay in a retrospective. He said that he coined the term socialism pejoratively, but he doesn't even know what socialism means anymore. In 1832, he coined the term socialism to describe the utopians who had their heads so far up their asses that they couldn't see the real world. In 1850, the word was being used as an umbrella term for a lot of social reform ideologies, specifically those that are anti-individualist and preach solidarity across borders, on a class level. So he said, I guess I need to call myself a socialist, but that's not really what I meant when I made up the term. So LaRue was a 19th century example of a prominent socialist saying he doesn't understand what socialism truly is. Fast forward to the 1940s, we have the next example of this, which is George Orwell. Now, in 1946, in the aftermath of World War II, he wrote an essay called Second Thoughts on James Burnham, where he became the rarest of birds, the English intellectual who says, yeah, my ideology failed.
Yep.
From the title, the essay is obviously a review of Burnham's works, but it's apropos of our overall discussion because he does so by contrasting the world in 1930 with the world of 1946. If you're not familiar with James Burnham, he was an American intellectual who swung from being a Trotskyist to being a hard right-winger after the Hitler-Stalin Pact. Going hard from left-wing to right-wing or right-wing to left-wing was not exactly unusual, especially in those days.
Yeah. You can walk across the floor sometimes, not a big deal.
Yeah, Burnham wrote 2 books about the rising managerial bureaucracies that seem to be taking control of Western societies and how democratic politics was going to turn back into old-fashioned power plays. Orwell was quite critical of Burnham's takes, especially because Burnham made a number of assessments about World War II that turned out to be completely wrong. In particular, he talked about how Nazi Germany's bureaucracy was going to stop them from making mistakes that were too catastrophic, but then Hitler said, no, we're invading Russia.
Yep.
Having said that, Orwell was writing in 1946 and Orwell died in 1950. This is perhaps a more personal bias, but I think that Burnham was vindicated by about the 70s or 80s, especially because I've had the pleasure of working for a gigantic corporate bureaucracy where nobody knows who is exactly in charge. but everybody's expected to join some pointless committee and follow countless pointless procedures.
You have to have at least 3 pieces of flair.
Well, yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, we mentioned that the zeitgeist of 1999 allowed for multiple movies like Office Space. Well, there you go. The work was portrayed as this immovable system of silly procedures where everything seems pointless. Exactly, those vindicate Burnham's writings. Orwell says that until about 1930, socialists had an idea of a, quote, free and equal society aiming at a universal human brotherhood, unquote. But even then, nobody really knew what socialism was supposed to be beyond some political movements that promoted, again, quote, political democracy, social equality, and internationalism. And before 1930, everybody since Karl Marx would have accepted that definition. You can even find books written before 1930 that describe socialism as being divided into 4 quadrants, where one axis is political, one is revolutionary. So if you're revolutionary and political, you'd be a Marxist. If you were revolutionary and non-political, you'd be an anarchist. If you were non-revolutionary and political, it meant that you supported some workers' rights party. And if you were non-revolutionary and non-political, it meant you were a syndicalist who supported strong labor unions completely independent of politics. In the 1930s, that all changed. First of all, you had Stalin's 5-year plan. And again, we'll be talking plenty about Stalin's 5-year plan when we talk about Soviet art. But Stalin justified it by calling it socialism in one country. In other words, fuck internationalism. I'm going to use the same buzzwords to slaughter the Gopniks.
Yep.
Yeah, Stalin said, I'm just going to build up the system so that I'm in charge. Then you had the Moscow trials, and you had the Great Purge when the mask just came off completely. Yep. The Russian went Russian.
Yep, it's always going to happen.
Orwell noted that Stalin's brutal turn in the 1930s did not exactly make the English intelligentsia sour on communism.
Yeah.
Quite the opposite, actually.
Oh, my.
A lot of English bureaucrats said, wait a second. You're telling me that there's a system where paper pushers with university degrees can use technology to brutally oppress the people they don't like?
Who have the power of life and death?
Sign me up. Now, Orwell is quite critical of Burnham, but he does commend Burnham for his honesty in not being like these intellectuals who call themselves socialists, while really just wanting Stalinism where they're the ones who are in charge.
Yep.
But that's not the only reason why Orwell said that the 1930s changed the definition of the word. It's hard to ignore the rise of Nazi Germany, which could have easily borrowed Stalin's label of socialism in one country as well.
Yep.
Hitler was certainly a totalitarian, but he loved putting things to a plebiscite to say that he was doing things in the name of the people, or more specifically, the Volk.
Yeah, homie was all about plebiscites.
The New Deal was also a nascent form of this bureaucratically run society, but in 1940, the American bureaucracy certainly hadn't developed as much as Germany or the USSR. But Pearl Harbor forced the Americans to scale up for the war effort, so they caught up quite quickly.
And the Japs did what?
A joke in the early Cold War years, during the early days of the military-industrial complex, was that they wanted to call this new system National Socialism, but the name was already taken. Now, some people say that Orwell gave up on socialism. If you read this essay, that's kind of true, but not completely. He still believes in what was called socialism up to 1930, but he says that now that term is completely devoid of any meaning. But Orwell was a smart guy. He was a little more sophisticated than just saying that socialism is dead because Hitler, Stalin, and FDR broke it. Agree or disagree with their ideas, until 1930, all of these self-styled socialist movements were about fixing the problems inherent in the industrial capitalist system. Of course, the industrial capitalist system was the only thing that allowed the political reforms to happen in the 1830s, which made socialist politics possible. But, there there were still serious questions about the freedom of the man in the factory and the vast economic inequality. But from the 1930s onwards, Orwell noted a new phenomenon, which is that with these large entrenched bureaucracies, governments and corporations realized that they could just start fixing their own economic problems without actually needing to give a shit about the proles.
Yep.
So what was the point of listening to the socialists anymore?
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Good point.
up until the 1930s, you would fix the problems of capitalism by listening to the socialists. Now it's, we'll just fix the problems. Who the fuck cares about these people?
Famously, Bismarck established employment insurance to ward off communism.
Yep. Well, this brings us back to our art discussion of why the poverty porn just disappeared. Because what good does poverty porn do when it was propagandizing a version of socialism that was now completely irrelevant to how society was run?
So it was like when in 2015, when all the girls got the memo to be non-binary.
Exactly.
All right.
Yeah, like with the rise of fascism and the big bureaucracies, and with books like Brave New World in the zeitgeist, and with Stalin being Stalin, it was clear that the goal had just shifted from politicians fixing the problems of the voters to bureaucrats fixing their own problems without giving a shit about anybody else. This is something we think happens now. No, Orwell wrote about this in 1946, and he says, right down to the year, he says this started in 1930 and now it's finished.
Okay.
In the 1920s, the socialists were waiting for the capitalists to lose an election so that they could take power, and the conservatives were smugly satisfied in their belief that socialism was never going to work. Then the 1930s came along, and both sides are completely surprised by the rise of fascism, and also the fact that Stalin shows that he clearly has no desire to return to capitalism, but he also couldn't give two shits about anybody's freedom or economic inequality. And here in the West, in 2026, we have completely airbrushed the 1930s out of history so that we can continue the LARP of having your two loudest relatives debate capitalism and socialism at the Thanksgiving table. That ship sailed 90 years ago, guys, coming up on 100.
It's like they're playing chess.
Yep.
Old pieces.
Let's not lose the plot, though. Let's go back. So, let's not lose the plot. This is still a series called How Art Got Ugly, and let's go back to the question I've been asking since episode 1. What is art? We have long since established that it's a tenuous at best concept, and we established in the last 2 episodes that our current concept of art is intimately tied to Paris in the 1920s, and to a lesser extent London and New York. But anybody can do weird shit. What makes it art instead of painting? An academy, a political movement, a group of prominent intellectuals, or a prestigious museum says that it is. That's the only difference. And I keep going back to the question, why do we need this concept called art? Why don't we just talk about painting and sculpture? Well, whatever art is, it's contextual and it's environmental. It doesn't exist outside of an ecosystem of critics, collectors, dealers, curators, gallery owners, intellectuals, etc., etc., etc. In our 7th episode, I boldly claimed that the concept of art was already dead by the end of the 20s, or at least it had become so incoherent that the word was meaningless. There were some attempts to revive the concept of art in the 40s with abstract expressionism, but it just gave us this.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
look at this shit.
It's like anarchist scroll.
Yeah. Or it looks like a Nazi band at the top.
Yeah. It's like a hate group's graffiti, and they're like evil henchmen house that they've squatted. It's like if I went into like Ernst Zundel's house in the 90s and this was in his garage, I would not be at all surprised.
But it was the hobo Nazis.
You don't mess with the hobo Nazis, son. Like, we're the master race of the homeless.
Oh, yeah. So this stuff was the late 40s and the early 50s, but nobody bought an abstract expressionist painting without a lot of coercion from Manhattan socialites. Mm-hmm. And by the 60s, the paragon of avant-garde culture was, as I said earlier, Andy Warhol videotaping homeless crackheads.
Bomb fights.
At that point,
Dr. Phil.
Yeah. Yeah, at that point, you can ask, wait, is this art? But the only correct response to that question is, who cares? Is this really worth debating anymore?
Yeah,
And the
catch
answer
me
is
outside.
no.
How about that?
I said at the start that we need to think of the 1930s as just another decade. We're steeped in propaganda that, for political reasons, replaces the 1930s with abstractions like the Great Depression or the rise of fascism in Germany. The 30s was just a decade with an ethos and an aesthetic, and our only real contact with that ethos is the cartoonish diesel punk aesthetic of Indiana Jones. The rest of this episode is going to be about an artist who was as synonymous with the 1930s as Buddy Holly was with the 50s or John Hughes was with the 80s, but he's completely forgotten now. That artist is Thomas Hart Benton. He did this.
Something going on here.
When you read contemporary writings by Benton or about Benton, he's very clearly from the same intellectual milieu that Indiana Jones was trying to portray. He was huge in the 1930s, but when the aesthetic shifted to the abstract Jackson Pollock shit in the early 40s, he faded away into relative obscurity. But he still produced works until the day he died in 1975. Literally the day he died. There is a mural at the Country Music Hall of Fame in Nashville that has a couple of missing details because Benton was putting the finishing touches on it when he dropped dead of a heart attack.
Wow.
See that? Like, notice there's no lines on those telephone poles. Like, but he was about to paint those lines on the poles when he dropped dead.
When it's your time, it's your time.
So this goes to show that there was always a demand for good painting, because this was 1975.
Yeah.
Even after the tastemakers in high society decided that real art with a capital A was minimalistic, reimagined, conceptual, challenging, conversation starting, a lot of other euphemisms for ugly. Fame is fickle, and tastes change all the time. MC Hammer and Vanilla Ice have spent 30 years paying the bills and going on reality shows and Where Are They Now documentaries and telling self-deprecating jokes about how they blew all their money because their 15 minutes of fame didn't last very long.
I perform at the Gathering now. I'm a juggalo.
We could say that Benton had his moment in the sun and then gracefully faded away. You know, that's just something that happens when you're in creative endeavors. You have a few years in the spotlight and then people's tastes change.
Yep.
But there's one huge reason why we have to look at Benton and we can't just look at him as a guy whose time came and went. And that's because while Benton was living in New York, he had a famous student named Jackson Pollock.
Oh, okay.
I told you I would get to Pollock eventually. I think I said this in the episode I released in January of last year.
Yep.
Now, this is really just a prologue. Pollock's full story is still to come, but we got to him. Benton joked that Pollock was born an artist, and the only thing that Pollock learned from him was how to drink a fifth a day. But that's not completely true. Let's take a look at an early work of Pollock's, and it's very clearly in the same style that Benton did. Just look at that.
Okay. It's not ugly. There's something going on here.
Yeah, it's called Going West in 1935.
Yeah, capturing something. Yeah, I like this. I would put this on a t-shirt. This would be nice on a t-shirt.
Now, we mentioned earlier that geologists and evolutionary biologists studied the fossil record in the 19th century and coined the term missing link to preserve the concept of the great chain of being. Well, here's the missing link from Benton's very figurative regionalism to Pollock's abstract expressionism. Look at that. It's hard to see how you would draw a line between the two of them, but yet looking at this painting, it does kind of make sense. I kind of see both the regionalists and the jizz painting here.
Yeah, definitely a transitional form.
Then a few years later, he did a painting called The Flame, which is even more expressionist, dipping its toe into abstraction, but not completely there yet. Look at that.
Something burning.
And then
this would be a nice blanket.
And then you had the final form.
Oh yeah, this is the painting that the guy finished on the Hedwig.
At one point, this broke the record for the most expensive painting sold at an auction.
That was before people could tape bananas to things.
Yep. Or sell stainless steel balloon dogs.
That's an ugly dog. I always like, it's like if my 5-year-old came up with that, it would be like, good job, buddy.
Well, like I said, we will still do a proper dive into Pollock. We're not there yet, but we've at least started his story. We've finally gotten to him. But right now we're looking at Benton. Now, Benton was in Paris doing his formal art education in 1908. Why is that year important? In our Paris episodes, we talked about the Puteaux group, which formed in 1908 and drove the entire Parisian avant-garde through all of its modernist movements from the day that Picasso and Braque invented Cubism in 1910, right through Dada, Surrealism, Purism, and the Expo of 1925. Benton was in Paris when all that stuff was starting out, and he was huge in American art when one of his students, Jackson Pollock, became the centerpiece of the aesthetic shift to abstraction in the 40s. And he was at the height of his fame in the 1930s, right in the middle of the period that is inconvenient for post-World War II propaganda narratives. You cannot understand Benton by just paying attention to the Museum of Modern Art's artificial narrative. You need to place him within the context that we just spent the last 8 episodes building up. And conversely, if you understand Benton's story, you also understand why the official narrative is a load of horseshit. Remember that in the 1930s, the United States was just another country. After World War II, it was the global hegemon, and the CIA used Jackson Pollock and all these other motherfuckers to fuel their Cold War propaganda, saying, America is so free that you can get away with this nonsense and not get sent to the gulag.
Imagine this being your job, peasant.
Benton was not a part of that at all. He was just a guy from Missouri. He wasn't worried about his work being a symbol of freedom or minority rights or anything else. He certainly cared about the issues. I think he was part of the New Deal coalition, but he was just a working artist. He was trying to ply his craft and sell paintings. Art is just like journalism, punk rock, and tattoos. Now it may be done by soft kids with trust funds who have never seen a day of manual labor in their lives. There was a time when it was done by rough-around-the-edges working men who sincerely didn't give a shit about respectability.
There we go.
That was Benton. But Benton did have a pedigree. His dad was a U.S. congressman, and his great-uncle was the senator for the state of Missouri. He was just born at a time when political kids, even those with creative interests, were considerably more masculine than, let's say, Justin Trudeau.
Yeah.
And he was a total slice of Americana. As a kid, he spent time between Missouri and Washington, D.C., so he wasn't just some country bumpkin farm boy. He was comfortable in both the Midwest and in the East Coast cities. He went to the Art Institute of Chicago in 1907. Then he moved to Paris to attend the Académie Julienne in 1908, which would be the equivalent of going to Juilliard today.
Okay.
If anything, it's almost remarkable how unremarkable his story was. Like, if you watch an American broadcast of the Olympics these days, every gymnast and figure skater has some super melodramatic story of overcoming just so much hardship, even though the hardship is usually rolling your ankle once.
Yeah, not like Nancy Kerrigan.
Well, you have to be born with a silver spoon shoved up your ass to even get into figure skating in the first place.
Oh, you have to have parents willing to dump so much freaking money into training you from a very young age to even have a chance to do that at the Olympic level. That you are like an heiress to something.
Yeah, but Benton's story was just, my dad was upper middle class. I went to art school in Paris. I worked in New York for a little bit, and then I moved back to Missouri, where my home life and marriage were relatively stable, especially for the standards of artists.
Oh, yeah.
This guy doesn't have a huge romantic story behind him. It's about as middle of the road as it gets for a surly alcoholic artist.
It's like Dave Chappelle living in his some little town.
Well, because Benton's story is so straightforward, it's hard to view him as anything but a complete product of the 20s and 30s. Even his side quests were perfectly fitting for the time. During World War I, he was a draftsman, and he painted camouflage designs on ships before radar made that obsolete.
Yeah, that's one thing that this guy might be good at.
Well, this is Pollock. I'm talking about Benton.
Yeah, but still. Fuck both.
Well, during the silent movie era, Benton painted sets because he was living in New York, and the movie industry was still based in New Jersey until the newer studios opened up in California to get as far away from IP laws as possible.
The secret history of California.
Well, the film industry was started by Thomas Edison because he invented the video camera. So at one point that was based in New Jersey. Benton was living in New York and painting movie sets in New Jersey.
Okay.
Since Benton went to school in Paris, he said that he experimented with all the, quote, cockeyed isms, like Impressionism, Pointillism, Cubism, and all the other movements we've gone over. Yes, since Benton went to school in Paris, he said he experimented with all the, quote, cockeyed isms like Impressionism, Pointillism, Cubism, and all the other movements we've gone over. Here is an example of Benton trying his hand at Cubism, for example.
Robot people.
Well, and then, everything about his story is just so 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
It's like now it looks like we're opening up a time capsule to, learn about a foreign time and place.
Yeah.
This guy's life story is just what we've been looking at for the last year. There's just almost nothing remarkable about it. That's why you can't study this guy's life and live in the fantasy version of the 30s we're given. Then Benton moved to New York, and he decided to call himself an enemy of modernism, doing stuff like this. This is called The People of Chilmark. It's one of the works that made him famous. This was done in 1920, but you can clearly see the figurative and almost caricatured style. What he would do is he would build little models and then just draw the models. That's why he's got kind of a weird style, but it was distinctive and it worked.
Yeah, it's really interesting here. If this is dynamic, it's got depth, it's got, conveys motion, purpose.
And also, I'm not going to pretend that the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel was photorealistic either.
Yeah, exactly. You're allowed to be stylistic. That's what separates it from a photograph at this point. It's, nice.
Yeah, so in the early 30s, he had his breakthrough mural commissions at roughly the same time that Grant Wood did American Gothic. So that proves that the whole folk Americana thing was not just an outlier. This is just the style that was in vogue in 1930. First, he did a mural called America Today. This is part of it.
Speaking of the cover of Big Sleep.
Well, now, this painting is supposed to be a nod to the American and working class and a morale booster during the worst part of the Great Depression, but it's very 1930s, and you can clearly see the influence of Art Deco and Futurism, and like you said, the Raymond Chandler novels. This is just the 30s aesthetic. It's not a fancy thing that one guy came up with. This is the world of the 30s. This is the aesthetic of the world we're trying to get our mind around. Like I said, the 30s are just a decade, and this is just like the fucking acid colors in the 70s. Then in 1932, he did another mural called The Arts of Life in America. Sorry.
Is that one painting?
Yeah, it's just one painting. Now, this painting, again, shows the common man, but it's a fairly obvious stylistic homage to Renaissance artists.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yep. It's got slight distortions reminiscent of El Greco, but more importantly, look at the fashion that people are wearing, especially in the middle one and on the right. You could absolutely drop Indiana Jones into that mural and he wouldn't look out of place.
No, even with the whip.
So then the World's Fair was held in Chicago in 1933, and he got a similar commission for that as well. But before we look at that, let's look at the poster for the event.
Wow.
Now, with the exception of Indiana Jones, everything we're supposed to believe about the 1930s comes from poverty porn. The World's Fair was a huge deal in 1933. Does this look like the poster for an event held against the backdrop of economic anxiety and crippling poverty?
It does not.
In the last episode, we mentioned that the term Art Deco didn't really exist until it was retroactively applied in the 60s, but this is very clearly Art Deco.
Yeah.
It's not just opulent, it screams optimism, as does the event's name at the bottom there, A Century of Progress.
Yep.
Now, don't get me wrong, the Depression was still certainly going on, and the event was supposed to be a bit of a pick-me-up, but the theme of the event was supposed to be the technological progress that was going to build the world of the future. Again, not poverty porn, not Steinbeck dust bullshit. The General Motors Pavilion was so popular that it inspired the Parade of Progress, which your boomer parents or grandparents will absolutely remember from their childhood. Benton did this mural for the event, sometimes called the Indiana mural. Now, these murals speak for themselves. Clearly, there was optimism about technological progress, even in the depths of the Great Depression, and clearly Benton was on a roll in 1933, which is why in 1934 he appeared on the cover of Time magazine, which was a huge deal in those days. Now nobody gives a shit, but in 1934 it mattered. Yeah, well, this is an artist who knows how to handle his booze.
Yeah.
A Time magazine puff piece is not exactly an objective assessment of anything, but then again, neither is museum catalog copy, especially when it comes to modern art. But Time's back catalog is freely available online, and you can read the article for yourself, and it feels like a glitch in the matrix of the official narrative. The narrative says that American art was stuffy until the Armory Show in 1913, and a French guy stuck a urinal into an art gallery in 1970. We've already beaten to death why that story is completely false, but as the story goes, Americans were slowly enlightened. Then all the European artists fled to New York to flee World War II, and then Europe was completely flattened, and New York replaced Paris as the capital city of modernism. That's the official story. This article in Time magazine talks about how since World War I, the Americans were trying to emulate Matisse and Picasso, but nobody could sell anything. If a collector wanted to buy art that looked like shit, it turned out that he'd rather get one from a famous artist than from a second-rate American.
Yeah.
If I'm going to buy garbage anyways, I'm going to buy a famous guy's garbage.
Exactly.
And we went over in the previous episode that Americans were trying to cosplay as sophisticated Europeans, not realizing that Cubism was never as popular in Europe as American socialites believed it was. Mm-hmm. The article described Benton's popularity as representative of Americans getting tired of trying to prove their sophistication by buying this shit.
Jesus.
So again, this is a glitch in the matrix. The narrative does not talk about any of this shit. Now, when asked about his critics who said that his murals were loud and lacked taste, Benton said that he was painting Americana, and the United States is a country full of people who are loud and lack taste.
That's spot on.
He said, I'm not a sentimentalist, which was probably a dig at Norman Rockwell, who he said was a talented illustrator, but not an artist. Yeah. Because, of course, creatives need to be petty about each other.
Well, of course, cat fights.
Now, the article talked about a few other folk Americana artists, including Grant Wood, American Gothic guy. But the article popularized two terms. The first is regionalism, which broadly meant art made far away from New York City, even though it was sold through the same old art circles in New York. The second is U.S. scene, or American scene, which we will come back to very shortly.
You hear that scene, kids? You're nothing new.
Yep, but as part of the shift back to realism, the article also brought up the Teos art colony, or Teos, I don't know how you pronounce that, in New Mexico. Paintings coming out of Teos were a little harder to classify because southwestern deserts have such unusual natural colors that some of it almost looks like French modernism. Like, here's a couple examples.
Yeah.
Like, is this a drug trip, or is this just the weird colors of the Southwest? I don't know.
Is this the Alamo?
Something else happened in the art world in the 30s, and that's the New Deal art program. First, the short-lived Public Works of Art project, which allocated Treasury Department funds to pay artists to paint murals for federal government buildings.
Finally, they're getting their free meals.
And then from 1935 until 1943, you had the much bigger federal art project under the Works Progress Administration, where all 50 states were allocated funds to put starving artists to work. Of course, a large bureaucratic project like that has to have rules governing the distribution of funds, and rules are not always conducive to producing great creative output.
No, absolutely not.
You know, you had interesting quirks like artists being paid by the hour at a nationwide fixed hourly wage, and quotas that meant some states hired creatives with vastly differing levels of talent.
Oh, my.
You know, there are...
Picturing Wesley Willis.
Yep. Wesley Willis totally would have gotten that. There are entire books written about the federal art program, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about it because virtually no notable art came out of the federal art program, even though hundreds of thousands of works were made. But there are a couple things that do matter to our overarching story. First of all, we made the point that whatever art is, the definition depends on the ecosystem of critics and collectors and the rest of them to give it legitimacy. Here is one example of a mural that came out of the federal art project. Like, it looks nice, and I'm sure there are a few buyers who would love to hang it in their living rooms, but there's no appetite to sell it for millions of dollars at Sotheby's or Christie's, where people pay millions for the banana duct tape to the wall. I'm sure that there's some art nerd out there who says, well, actually, there are 3 or 4 pieces from the federal art project that are highly valued, but fine. My point still stands. We've run the experiment, and once you have rent the creative process from this ecosystem, most of the value disappears.
You got to fight your way up, folks.
Yep. This is still the age of utopianism, and on some level, the government art projects were a cargo cult, thinking that if you threw enough money at creatives, you would get 1920s Paris.
You get nothing. You get drug problems.
Exactly. That just didn't happen. Paris didn't happen. So I submit this as Exhibit A for my case that art has been an incoherent term since at least the 1930s, if not the 20s. Unlike the federal art project, which was more just a straight-up make-work program, the Public Works of Art project was focused more on bringing quality art to the public square. Like, you had to know your shit to be hired by that program. And one of the stated objectives of the PWP was to promote the American scene. That's the term I said earlier. American scene was the 2 movements we've been looking at in this episode. Regionalism, i.e. the folk Americana, and social realism, i.e. the poverty porn meant to raise awareness. And like I said earlier, they weren't mutually exclusive. There were plenty of artists who were considered both regionalist and social realist. But even within the much bigger and much less restricted federal art program where you weren't forced to do things in the American scene, most artists still chose to do that. Most artists still voluntarily chose to do American scene painting. Some did the abstract modernism, and they certainly had the freedom to do so. Some even preferred to do the old-fashioned academic stuff. But this contemporary realism was just the aesthetic of the 1930s in the way that neon colors and hairspray were the aesthetic of the 80s. Just think of it as another decade. That's the point I'm trying to get across. Now, I don't want to dwell too much on the Federal Art Project because by the early 40s, it was all forgotten. Some of the famous mid-century artists paid the bills by working on the project, but it just did not leave any sort of meaningful aesthetic legacy, at least in the most prestigious creative circles. Now, we're going to wrap this episode up by finishing off Benton's story because he had a few things to say about that transition from the 30s figurative stuff to the 40s abstract stuff. And his autobiography is as reliable a source as any about what happened during this period to this thing we call art. Benton was too successful and too established to have needed help from the Federal Art Project, so he remained in New York's prestige circles, at least until 1935. That was when he got tired of New York and decided to move back to Missouri for good, taking a job at the Kansas City Art Institute.
I wonder what would cause him to run back to a conservative place.
While the truckers were loading his stuff onto the truck, he sat down and wrote an essay. That essay was later published under the title A Farewell to New York, and it alienated him from the New York scene by being uncomfortably honest about a few things.
Oh my.
Like
Mel Gibson?
Well, I'm just going to go through this. The synopsis of the essay is that New York has become so crowded and decadent that as an artist, he has to deal with three groups of people who are completely cut off from reality. And in all three cases, the group is out of touch precisely because of the environment in a place like New York. The first group is the intellectuals. This was the Red Decade when, as I said earlier, New York was sometimes called the most interesting part of the Soviet Union. In the next episode, we'll really dive into international communism in the 30s, but if you were a communist in the 30s, you were using the term party line unironically. When the Comintern in Moscow sent out orders to subvert organizations with communist messaging, you would follow those orders if you didn't want to be kicked out of the club.
Yep.
And since New York was full of communists, more of the Eastern European variety.
I was going to say was full of communists.
A lot of art in the early 30s took a markedly militant shift, ordered from the Comintern and driven by the fact that Stalin wanted an ethos of militancy to justify the 5-year plan and the Holodomor.
Yep.
Between 1930 and 1935, American prestige painting, literature, and theater could best be described as fan fiction, only instead of white girls inserting a black transsexual into every story, it was middle-class people inserting working-class characters into everything, suffering under the evils of capitalism.
Oh, jeez.
Did the working class appreciate this? Not exactly.
Thank you, working class Joe.
The thing about the working class is that they're just too poor to care.
Yep. They don't have any money to spend on any of your products. So.
Now, a lot of the tactics that communists figured out during the 30s are still used in political activism today. One tactic that came out of this era was joining an established organization and throwing tantrums, accusing everyone of being a fascist until the leadership gets frustrated and quits.
Yep.
Does that sound familiar?
Yep.
This is relevant to the art world because the social realists were mostly communists, and again, mostly of the Hebraic persuasion.
Call them like we see them, folks. Sorry.
And the social realists like to accuse the regionalists of having fascist sympathies for painting Americana instead of showing more abstract and international stuff like poverty and class struggle.
Oh, God.
So even back in the 30s, you were called a fascist if you disagreed with these people on the slightest thing.
Okay. It's an old school. That was literally the party line. Okay.
Yeah. But, especially with socialists, Communists loved to take over socialist organizations and accused everybody of being what was called a social fascist.
Oh, okay. That's I can see that evolving into something nasty.
But in this essay, Benton wasn't even complaining about that. He just said that New York is full of stuck-up intellectuals who think they're sophisticated by parroting an ideology that comes out of Europe instead of thinking for themselves. Mm-hmm. He makes sure to note that it's not all of New York's intellectuals. It's just so prevalent in the art world that every young artist gets caught up in progressive politics, trying to get the approval of the older people in the scene, and ends up, quote, dogmatic, self-righteous, and humorless. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
Of course, there's plenty of infighting amongst the progressive factions, and you can tell Benton was a true artist because he says, at first, I loved being part of these ideological battles, but now I'm just having too much fun trolling the humorless scolds to rile them up.
Yep. Yeah, you and me both, buddy.
The second group stifling the arts in New York City was the conservative old money. That's nothing new. Every artist hates them, especially when you depend on rich people for patronage, yep. And rich people don't want to dump money into experimental artwork. Yep. Now, I know that the whole decade is airbrushed out of history, but notwithstanding that, this essay that I'm talking about, it's strangely difficult to find it reproduced anywhere online. You find a lot of secondary sources saying that this essay made a lot of waves in New York. It was oddly difficult for me to find an actual copy of it, even on the internet.
How strange.
I think it's because of his description of the third group stifling the arts. And I'm going to read this verbatim because I don't want to be accused of exaggeration. Between the forces of the narrowly conservative and the doctrinaire radical, another influential force thrives in this city. This last is even more completely withdrawn from the temper of America than either of the others. While urban isolation promotes the peculiar narrowness of the first two, it is essential to the very existence of the third. It comes from the concentrated flow of aesthetic-minded homosexuals into various fields of artistic practice.
Oh, there we go.
He continues. Aestheticism in its more fragile forms seems to always accompany sexual aberration when that is represented by the simple predominance of feminine characteristics, rather than the cultivated vices of bisexualism.
So the bisexuals are the connoisseurs, okay.
Well, he says, in the case of the latter, i.e. the bisexual, male sexual buffooneries, i.e. complete sex addiction, offset any exaggerated artistic delicacy. Says, once they become sex addicts, I'm not too worried about them because they're not going to interfere with my work. Yeah. They're too busy out there having 1,300 sexual partners.
Yeah. Okay. Laying the groundwork for...
Quote, but in the homosexual circles of artistic New York, there are also few who are ready to jump anything from a steer to a kitchen mechanic.
Yep.
Our New York aberrants are, for the most part, of the gentle feminine type, with predilections for the curving wrist and outthrust hip.
So they're swish.
He continues. Far be it from me to raise my hands in any moral horror over the ways and tastes of individuals. If young gentlemen, or old ones either, wish to wear women's underwear and cultivate extraordinary manners, it's all right with me. But it is not all right with the art which they affect and cultivate. It's not all right when, by ingratiation or subtle connivance, I'll leave it to you to figure out what he means by subtle connivance.
Bomb stuff.
Precious fairies.
Mouth stuff.
Precious fairies get into positions of power and judge, buy, and exhibit American pictures under the sway of those overdelicate refinements of the taste characteristic of their kind. I'm reading this verbatim, guys.
Yeah, don't hate us.
This is 1935. Don't tell me that these people were oppressed in the 50s until some sort of liberating movement at Stonewall. No, this is 1935, guys. Yep. They were already infiltrating every art gallery in New York. Benton continues.
No.
taste, good taste, is simply the acceptance and cultivation of prevailing modes, manners, and attitudes. When such an acceptance is heightened by the exquisite differentiations of the homosexual, it becomes morbidly narrow and highly critical of innovation. He takes a couple paragraphs to ensure us that he's not a bigot, and he knows there are plenty of swishy gays who have discernment. He's very clear about that. But, and again I quote, for the most part, the fairies are so deeply involved in their own peculiar sensibilities, so intent on their own jealousies, hysterical animosities, and nurse preferences, that they cannot appreciate contemporary forces until those have been consecrated by general acceptance. In other words, they're too involved with fag drama.
This is why Hitler's bodyguard was full of gay guys.
Yeah.
It was by design. He knew that they'd never work together against him because they were all too catty.
There's just one more paragraph, and at this point I have to finish this. Homosexuals are very important factors in the museums and galleries of the cities. While it is too much to say that they have captured all of them, they are in evidence at every turn. In an important training school of taste appended to one of the great Eastern universities, they have made deep inroads, and potential directors of museums emerge from the sanctums of this institution with a lisping voice and mincing ways.
It's contagious. The culture, not the, well, I guess the gay too.
Depends how young you get fucked. They emerge also with specially conditioned psychologies.
Yeah, that would be fair. Based on
yeah, that's one way of putting it. But the art community of New York did not appreciate this assessment. Here's the thing, though. Trends don't stay in elite circles for very long before they trickle down to the hoi polloi. For example, after the sexual revolution, the boomers had wealthy people living alternative lifestyles. Generation X had trailer trash in the same living arrangements on the Jerry Springer Show.
Yeah.
If you picture a transgender millennial, you picture a rich kid with overindulgent parents. If you picture a transgender Zoomer, you picture a fat girl at Walmart with green hair and a hoodie.
That's fair.
Benton moved back to Missouri in 1935 to get away from this stuff. In 1941, before Pearl Harbor, he became the first high-profile person to get canceled from teaching for homophobia. After an interview where he said, do you know what's wrong with the art business in America? It's the third sex in the museums. Even in Missouri, we're full of them. Now, this did not exactly hurt his income in 1941. He was able to work steadily selling paintings for the next 35 years until he dropped dead in his studio. And at one point, Harry Truman said that Benton was his famous artist. So, you know, he sold his stuff. He didn't need the approval of the swishy people in the galleries.
So it's like the guy who's got the big following online.
Yeah, exactly.
Not dependent on,
yep,
you know, this or that media source.
Yep. But Benton's moment of fame was over by the early 40s when the war came and when tastes shifted in a more abstract direction. Every art history book, if it talks about the 30s at all, says that Benton blamed the institutions for forcing the change, but they never seem to go into more detail than that, because, you know, now we've gone back to the source and we see the specifics of his theory.
I can see why they wanted to brash over, you know, yada yada some of this.
Now, I said a few episodes back that American Gothic seems to break a pattern. In the 1890s, you had the post-impressionists like Van Gogh. In the 1900s, you had the Fauvists. Then in 1910, Picasso invented Cubism. There were all sorts of crazy aesthetics in the 20s, and then Jackson Pollock was the man of the hour in the 40s. Why is the most famous painting of the 30s this one? I say we should treat the 30s as just another decade because really when you look at Benton's full story, nothing seems that out of place if you just think of the 30s as another decade. Not the Great Depression, not the rise of Hitler, not even the age when everybody's a communist, just a decade. But the 30s, especially the early 30s, were the end of a lot of things. Like, just to recap the things we talked about in this episode, they were the end of the status quo that had been around since the 1830s. They were the end of the kind of politics where an organized political party could really get in and change the system. They were the end of utopian thinking. They were the end of workers' rights-based political radicalism. Orwell noted that they were the end of socialism in any sense of the word that would have been recognized by Karl Marx. It's the end of one more thing, though. In a previous episode, we looked at the paintings of John Singer Sargent, and we said that at the turn of the century, he was the face of American art. As a reminder, here's what his stuff looked like. He did the official painting of Teddy Roosevelt.
I was going to say, he did jujitsu.
Well, it seems like Sargent did a lot of different styles of art. He was very talented. The 30s were just the end of this as well. The 30s were the end of this being the face of American art. And if you believe Thomas Hart Benton, it was also the end of traditional masculinity in the art scene.
For anybody who hasn't had to deal with the Velvet Mafia, gay men have a very particular way of organizing and networking, and they can be quite formidable and punch above their weight in terms of influence in an organization. So,
and if you're willing to network with them, they think, oh boy, you're willing to pay your dues.
Yep. It was funny. Any money that we made off them, we called that the tolerance dividend.
Well, if you look at any endeavor in this world, when it loses its masculine energy, it loses its vitality. So I'm sticking with my theory that art was already done by 1930. The chess game is still going to play out for a few decades until Andy Warhol, but something is finally going to checkmate it in the early 70s. So in conclusion, looking back on the regionalists, they had their moment for a few years in the early 30s. Then they faded into obscurity, but that's not exactly a sad story. Most creatives spend their entire careers wishing they could get 3 or 4 years with that level of fame. There is a certain timeless quality to regionalist art, which is more than you can say for their contemporaries, the social realists. Even though the social realists lasted a few more years in New York doing their poverty porn, they eventually faded into obscurity as well. So that puts us a few years into the 1930s. And the United States is not the only place where the aesthetics took a more conservative shift in the 1930s. So in the next episode, we're going to shift to Europe, where the two most important men in the art world are named Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, and I hope you guys join us for that.
I can't wait.
All right, you know the drill. Like and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Support us at kofi.com/Radio Free History or at subscribestar.com/radio-free-history.